Welcome, dear listener. Tonight we descend into the soot-black world of the Victorian coal pits, a place where dawn and dusk are meaningless because the light of the sun never reaches the men who dig below. In this world, central heating is not a luxury. It is the very coal pried loose from the bowels of the earth. The pay is poor, the danger constant, and the work consumes both body and breath. You rise before the cock crows, not to see daylight, but to vanish beneath it, carrying with you a tin lamp, a pick, and a stomach that already aches with hunger. Before we begin, be sure to like, share, and subscribe, only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. It's super amazing how there are so many viewers across the world who enjoys this type of content. Please be sure to drop a comment below to let me know what part of the world you're listening from. I would truly appreciate that. Now lay back, relax, maybe have some wine, with a cozy blanket, and let's travel together. Way back together. The path to the minehead is muddy and slick, trampled by boots that have walked it every day for years. Wagons wait at the mouth of the pit, wooden wheels creaking under the weight of yesterday's haul. The smell is distinct, smoke, sweat, and damp earth clinging to everything. You join the line of men, their eyes downcast, their faces already streaked with dust, though the day's labour has not yet begun. It is not camaraderie that binds you, but resignation. The pit has claimed their fathers, and it will claim their sons. The descent begins in a cage, an iron lift lowered on chains, squealing as it goes down. The deeper you drop, the colder the air feels at first, until it changes suddenly, becoming close, thick, and damp. The light above vanishes quickly. Soon the darkness swallows everything but the flicker of the small flame you carry. You press your hand to the walls, wet stone, rough and unyielding. The cage rattles, the chains groan, and still you sink until your ears pop with the weight of earth pressing down from every side. At the bottom, the cage opens into a narrow passageway no taller than a man crouched over. You stoop, shoulders brushing the jagged stone, and step into the labyrinth of tunnels. The sound of dripping water echoes faintly, joined by the distant thud of picks striking rock. The miners disperse like ants into burrows, each man heading for his assigned seam. The tunnels twist and bend in unnatural patterns, carved wherever coal veins promised profit. The lamps hanging from the walls glow weakly, illuminating only a few feet ahead, and beyond that, nothing but darkness. You reach your working face, a wall of rock streaked with coal, glimmering faintly when the lamp's light catches it. The task is simple, brutal, and endless. Swing the pick, break the seam, shovel the fragments into waiting carts. The coal splinters into shards, coating your hands in black dust. Every strike of the pick sends vibrations up your arms, rattling your bones. The air is thick with powder that clings to your throat and lungs. You cough, but coughing does nothing. It only proves how much of the mine is already inside you. Nearby, boys called trappers sit in darkness. They're only tasked to open and shut wooden doors that control the flow of air. They're as young as 6 or 7, sitting alone for hours with nothing but rats for company. When a cart needs to pass, they pull the door open. When it passes, they close it. That is their entire day. For their silence, they are paid pennies. Many grow up never knowing the sky by daylight, their childhoods buried underground before their bodies ever are. The carts creak as they fill, each load pulled by ponies that have never seen the sun. These animals live their entire lives underground, their coats matted with soot, their eyes dulled by eternal night. They learn the tunnels better than the men do, stepping sure-footedly through twisting passages, dragging tons of coal behind them. Their handlers whistle softly, guiding them like shadows through the maze. The ponies, like the miners, rarely leave the pit. When they do, they stumble in shock at the brightness of daylight, their eyes watering, their legs uncertain on the open ground. Hours pass, though time here is meaningless. You measure it not by clocks, but by the aching of your back, the bruises forming on your shoulders, the dryness of your throat. The lamps burn low, and every miner carries a quiet dread of the thing they cannot see or smell. The gas that seeps invisibly through the stone. Fire damp, they call it, and a single spark can turn the tunnels into a roaring furnace. To test the air, some carry small birds in cages. The canary's song is a measure of your own life. When it falters, you know the air is turning deadly. Sometimes the roof above shudders. A small rain of pebbles falls onto your helmet and every man freezes listening. If the earth groans too loudly, it means collapse is near. The lucky ones hear it in time to crawl out. The unlucky are buried where they fall, their bodies becoming part of the same earth they spent their lives hacking apart. Families wait at the pit head, counting names, never certain who will walk back into the daylight and who will not. The overseers move through the tunnels, lanterns swinging, barking orders to dig faster, haul more, fill every cart to the brim. The profit must flow, and the safety of the men is little more than a passing thought. Fines are issued for a pick swung too slowly, for a seam left unfinished, for a cart underfilled. To be a miner is to live with constant hunger. Hunger for bread, hunger for air, hunger for wages that never quite keep up with the cost of survival. When you finally pause, muscles trembling, you dip a tin cup into a barrel of water. The water tastes of rust and stone, but you swallow greedily. Sweat trickles into your eyes, stinging, mixing with the coal dust on your face until it feels like mud plastered onto your skin. There is no washing it away, not truly. The dust sinks deep into the lines of your hands, the creases of your lungs, leaving a stain that follows you even into sleep. When the shift finally ends, there is no whistle or clock to mark the time, only the overseer's barked command. You stumble back through the tunnels, legs aching, carrying the weight of coal dust in your lungs. The ponies are unhitched, left in stables carved into the earth itself, fed oats and water before the men are even considered. The cage creaks upward, chains straining as it lifts you slowly back to the surface. The first breath of outside air feels sharp, almost cruel against your throat. Some men cough violently, their chests rattling, as if the mine itself refuses to let them go. The village that surrounds the pit is built on the backs of those who work within it. Rows of soot-blackened cottages stand shoulder to shoulder, each one filled with families bound by the mine's grip. Laundry hangs stiff on lines, stained permanently grey no matter how much lye soap is used. Children play barefoot in the mud, their games interrupted by fits of coughing that seem far too old for their years. Wives scrape together thin meals of bread, potatoes and cabbage, while praying the wages handed over at week's end will stretch just far enough to cover rent to the company landlord, who also owns the mine. In the evenings, the men gather at the tavern, not for merriment but for necessity. Allais washes away the coal dust that water cannot, burning throats raw but numbing lungs just enough to sleep through the night. Stories are told of near misses, the ceiling that almost gave way, the gas that almost lit, the limb that almost broke. Every man carries a scar or a cough, and the older ones cough more than they speak. Some sit silently, staring into their mugs as if they can see the next collapse waiting in the froth. At home, the routine continues. Boots are left outside the door, crusted with layers of black dust so thick they seem carved from stone. Clothes are beaten against fences, but the air fills with more soot than is knocked away. Mothers press cloths to their children's mouths when they cough too hard, whispering prayers that they will not inherit the same fate as their fathers. Yet by morning the boys rise early to run messages to the pit to hold lamps to trap doors, beginning the same cycle that swallowed their fathers whole. Illness spreads easily in these rows of cottages. Black lung creeps silently through families, carried home in every breath the miners take underground. Coughs deepen into rattles, rattles into wheezes, until men cannot climb from their beds without gasping. The doctor offers little more than tonics and advice to rest, though rest is impossible when wages vanish with absence. Widows are left to scrub floors, take in laundry, or remarry quickly, for survival has no patience for grief. Children too small for the pits are sent to work in factories, where the air is no cleaner and the hours are no shorter, and yet amid this misery small rituals emerge. The sound of church bells on Sundays draws villagers from their homes, coal dust washed from faces as best as it can be. Families sit in wooden pews, their clothes plain but their voices steady in hymns that rise above the soot-stained rooftops. For a few hours the mine's grip loosens. Mothers clasp their children's hands, fathers bow their heads, and together they cling to faith that promises a life beyond the earth that has consumed so many of them already. Back in the pits, accidents are common enough that they scarcely shock anyone anymore. A roof fall can bury a man in an instant, his name whispered at the tavern by evening and replaced by another's the next day. Explosions of gas, fire damp as the miners call it, tear through tunnels, turning men to shadows burned onto walls. Survivors crawl out with faces blackened, eyes wide with the knowledge that luck is the only reason they still draw breath. Bells toll in the village, funerals follow, and the pits never close for long. Coal waits for no man, and profit waits for no death. Even when disaster strikes, it is the workers who carry the burden. Compensation is meagre, if offered at all. Families receive a few coins, enough to cover a funeral but never enough to replace the wages of the dead. Children are sent down earlier, sometimes before their 10th year, to fill the gaps left behind. They crawl into seams too narrow for grown men, their small bodies twisted into impossible spaces where the air is fouler and the darkness thicker. When they emerge, their faces are hollow-eyed, their childhood stolen before it could ever begin. And still, the mine rules everything. It dictates the rhythm of meals, the length of lives, the very air that families breathe. Streets are paved with the dust of it, windows filmed with its residue, lungs lined with its ash. The mine is not just a workplace, it is the village itself, the unyielding master under which every life bends. To be a miner is not to live beside the pit, but inside it, even when you walk in daylight. The pit was never just a place of work. It was also a battlefield, though the weapons were rarely steel or gunpowder. Instead, they were silence, refusal, and the stubborn will to endure without breaking. From time to time, the men, worn to their bones and driven past patience, laid down their picks and shovels. A strike was called, and for days or weeks the mines fell silent. The carts sat idle, and the overseers cursed the stillness that robbed them of profit. These moments were tense, for to strike was to risk hunger, eviction, and even violence. Yet without them, nothing would ever change. The company men despised strikes, and they had their methods of control. Company stores kept miners tethered, selling bread and candles at inflated prices so that wages returned to the very hands that had paid them out. If a man withheld his labour, he might find his credit cut off, his debts suddenly called in, or his family forced from their rented cottage. The mine owners knew that a man could withstand hunger for a time, but he could not watch his children starve. Desperation was as sharp a tool as any pick, and it cut deepest when applied to families. Still, solidarity bred in the tunnels where men crouched shoulder to shoulder, sharing air and fear alike. In those dark spaces, trust was forged as strong as iron. Whispers travelled quickly, plotting the next work stoppage, the next petition to Parliament, the next gathering in a muddy field where torches glowed like stars. Songs were sung in the evenings, not of joy but of resolve, verses about broken backs and broken promises, choruses that rolled through taverns until even the walls seemed to echo with defiance. The mine owners were not blind to the danger. They hired blacklegs, men brought in from distant towns, to cross picket lines and swing picks in place of strikers. These men arrived under the guard, their heads lowered against the jeers and stones thrown by the villagers who saw them as traitors. Fights broke out in the streets, boots striking mud, fists landing hard, until constables intervened with batons and arrests. A strike was never merely a pause in work. It was a tearing apart of communities. Neighbours turned against each other, survival pitted against solidarity. Government too had its hand in the struggle. Soldiers sometimes marched into pit villages, red coats bright against the grey cottages, muskets glinting in the weak sun. Their presence was meant to intimidate, to remind the miners that resistance could be met with more than fines. It could be crushed under bayonets and boots. Yet even so, strikes returned again and again, as inevitable as the coughs that haunted the lungs of every man underground. For each silence broken by force, another would rise months or years later, for misery is patient, and so is the will to fight it. Among the miners themselves, leaders emerged, ordinary men with extraordinary stubbornness. They wrote letters, gathered signatures, and risked imprisonment to demand shorter hours, safer tunnels, and wages that did not vanish back into the company store. Some were mocked as fools, others were jailed, but their words took root. Slowly, painfully, reforms trickled in, limits on the youngest children sent below, inspectors with lanterns and notebooks walking the tunnels, new rules to lessen, if never to erase, the dangers. Each reform was written not with ink, but with the blood and breath of the men who had already perished. Even in small victories, suffering lingered. The hours remained long, the risks never gone. Collapses continued, Explosions still tore through tunnels, and Black Lung continued its slow, invisible harvest. Yet within the taverns and cottages, the stories of those who resisted lived on. They spoke of strikes won and lost, of men who had stood tall against owners, of moments when the mine fell silent not because of accident or death, but because the workers had chosen silence as their weapon. For the children listening in shadowed corners, those stories planted seeds that would grow into the movements of the next century. Through it all, the mine never slept. Even when empty of men, it loomed over the village, its headgear jutting against the sky, its chimneys sighing smoke into the clouds. It was a reminder that coal was not just fuel, but power. Power for factories, power for locomotives, power for cities that burned bright while the villages that mined it sat in darkness. Each lump of coal carried with it the weight of lives shortened and bodies broken, but few outside the pit ever paused to think of that. For them, coal was only warmth in the hearth, speed on the rails, light in the lamps. Morning begins before the sun rises, though the miners see little of it anyway. The rooster crows, children stir beneath thin blankets, and the air in the cottage is cold enough to frost the inside of the window panes. Bread, if there is any, is stale. Porridge, if the cupboard allows, is thin and grey. A wife presses a tin lamp into her husband's hand, kisses his soot-crusted cheek, and watches him leave, knowing she may not see him return. The boots he laces are stiff with yesterday's mud and coal dust, and yet they will be just as blackened by evening. The path to the pithead is lined with others just like him, rows of stooped figures marching silently through the chill. Some carry small tins of food, a hunk of bread, a wedge of cheese, maybe a slice of salted pork if luck has been kind. Others carry nothing, knowing that hunger will simply accompany them below. The pithead rises above the village like a black crown, its winding gear already clanking as the first cage lowers into the earth. The sound is metallic, harsh, a reminder that the mine is not a place of welcome but of command. Once underground, hours blur together. A miner crouches low, his back hunched, swinging his pick in motions that repeat endlessly. The coal shatters, the fragments tumble, and his breath quickens as the dust rises to choke him. Sweat trickles down his spine, though the air is cold. The body labours against stone as if wrestling a giant that never tires. Around him, the tunnels echo with the same rhythm. Picks striking, shovels scraping, ponies snorting under their loads. It is a chorus of exhaustion, played out in darkness that seems eternal. Breaks are brief, if they happen at all. Men pull tin flasks from their pockets, sipping water that tastes of metal, or gnaw at bread gone hard as iron. Laughter is rare, though sometimes a jest is muttered, half-hearted to break the monotony. Most of the time, silence rules. Talking wastes breath, and in air so poor, each lungful must be guarded like treasure. Every cough feels heavier than the last, each rattle in the chest a reminder of the black lung waiting patiently to claim them. Children, too, are part of this daily grind. The trappers sit alone in pitch black, no lamp allowed for fear of fire damp. They push doors open when ponies approach, then close them again, hour after endless hour. Some sing softly to themselves, others count stones on the ground to mark time. For many, their first words are learned underground, their first friendships forged in whispers between shifts. By the time they are old enough to swing a pick, the mine is already etched into their bones. At the end of the shift, there is no triumph, only release. The cage rattles upward, and men blink against the faint daylight, their faces blackened so fully that only their eyes gleam white. They trudge home with slow steps, heads lowered, shoulders stooped as if the weight of the earth still clings to them. Wives wait at doorways with buckets of water, scrubbing the worst of the soot away before supper. The water turns black instantly, a swirling reflection of the pit that cannot be emptied fast enough. Evenings are no escape. A miner's body aches too deeply to rest easily. He stretches out on a straw mattress, bones sore, lungs rattling. The cottage is noisy with coughing, his children's, his neighbours echoing faintly through the thin walls. The fire burns low, fed by scraps of coal set aside from the pit, too precious to waste yet never enough to truly warm the room. Sleep comes eventually, not as comfort but as a collapse, and in the dreams that follow the mine is never far. And so the cycle repeats, day after day, year after year, until the body gives out. Some collapse underground, buried in dust or stone. Others linger at home, coughing into rags stained with black, eyes dimming as their lungs finally fail. Few grow old. Those who do are bent and broken, their hands stiff, their voices hoarse, their backs permanently curved by decades of crouching in tunnels too small to stand upright. The mine does not let go of its men even when they leave it behind. Meals in a miner's home were as sparse as the daylight he saw. Breakfast, if one could call it that, was often nothing more than bread dipped in weak tea. On good weeks, when wages stretched, there might be porridge, thickened with oats and water, sometimes sweetened with a drizzle of treacle. Meat was rare, kept for Sundays or holidays, when a family might share a single joint between them, stretching it with potatoes until it served as many mouths as possible. Children learned early to chew slowly, not for manners but to fool their stomachs into thinking the food would last. Wives bore the burden of making every scrap count. They boiled bones until nothing remained but cloudy broth, baked crusts of bread into puddings sweetened with a handful of dried fruit, and saved bacon grease in jars to smear on bread as if it were butter. Women were accountants as much as cooks, measuring flour by the ounce, counting each potato as if it were coin. They stretched the wages their husbands brought home, often paid in tokens redeemable only at the company store where prices were fixed against the poor. Hunger was constant, but starvation was held at bay by ingenuity and endless labour. Children played their part in survival too. Little girls carried pails of water, scrubbed clothes blackened by soot, or watched younger siblings while mothers took in laundry from wealthier townsfolk. Boys not yet old enough for the pit-earned pennies as errand runners, delivering coal to neighbours or fetching supplies from the company store. There was no childhood in the sense we know it now. Play was stolen in muddy lanes between chores, laughter snatched between coughs. Dolls were made of rags, toy carts carved from scraps of wood, and every game ended the moment a chore called them back. Inside the cottages, cleanliness was a battle fought and lost daily. No matter how many times floors were scrubbed, a layer of black dust returned within hours. Sheets turned grey, curtains stiffened with soot, and even the walls seemed to sweat coal. Women beat rugs outside until their arms ached, shook bedding into the wind, and still the dust settled again, carried home on every boot and every lungful of breath. To live in a pit village was to accept that coal was not confined to the pit itself, but seeped into every corner of life, every crevice of the home, every pore of the skin. Sundays offered the faintest reprieve. Families washed as best they could, scrubbing faces raw with cold water, donning clothes kept aside only for church. These garments were patched and mended, yet they carried the dignity of being Sunday best. Children filed beside their parents into pews, hair slicked down, hands clasped together. Hymns rose into the rafters, voices trembling with exhaustion yet firm with hope. It was in church that women whispered their worries to one another, that men exchanged nods of solidarity, that communities stitched themselves together against the weight of another week below ground. Yet even on these days the mine loomed. The pithead towered over the village, its silhouette a dark reminder that tomorrow the cycle would begin again. Some men left church early to tend to ponies still stabled underground, ensuring they had food and water even on a supposed day of rest. The pit was never truly silent. Pumps thudded steadily, keeping water from flooding the tunnels, gears groaned, and smoke curled into the sky as if the earth itself were breathing. Women knew the mine as intimately as the men, though they never descended. They knew it through the coughs of their husbands, the soot that blackened their washing, the wages that never stretched enough, and the funerals that came too soon. Many took in boarders, single men who worked the pit but had no families, cramming them into already crowded cottages for a few extra coins each week. Daughters grew up watching their mothers mend, scrub and save, inheriting the same cycle of labour that trapped their fathers underground. And always, the cough. It rattled through cottages at night, echoing from house to house like a grim lullaby. Children coughed, fathers coughed, mothers coughed too, though they never saw the pit themselves. The dust travelled home in every hair, every pore, every ragged breath. Some nights the coughing was so constant that sleep felt impossible, broken by fits that left throats raw and chests aching. In these moments the mind felt not like a place but a presence, a shadow that never left them, even in their beds. Holidays, when they came, were brief flickers of light in a long corridor of dark labour. Christmas meant perhaps a goose, if the family had been saving carefully all year, though often it was only a larger loaf of bread or a pudding made richer with raisins bought in secret. The cottage smelled of nutmeg and smoke, and children laughed louder than usual, though their faces were still pale and thin. May Day brought small parades, ribbons tied to poles, and fiddles played in the village square, though even then men's hands were cracked and blackened, their laughter tempered by fatigue. Leisure was never full escape. Even in joy, coal clung stubbornly beneath fingernails and in the creases of skin. Illness was constant, and remedies were often little more than hope in liquid form. Mothers mixed honey with vinegar to soothe sore throats, or pressed hot cloths against chests rattling with coughs. Onion poultices were tied to children's feet to draw out sickness, mustard plasters applied to backs in the belief that pain in one place might distract the body from pain in another. Herbal teas of chamomile, horehound, or peppermint were brewed in chipped mugs, though they offered little beyond comfort. Doctors were too costly for most, and when they came, they prescribed tonics heavy with alcohol or opiates that dulled symptoms, but never cured the underlying rot in the lungs. Accidents cast the heaviest shadow. A roof fall underground, a runaway cart, or an unexpected blast of gas meant widows left standing in doorways, aprons clutched in trembling hands, waiting for news. Sometimes bodies were brought up swiftly, blackened but intact. Other times men simply vanished into the earth, their graves the very tunnels they had carved. Widows had little time to grieve. Rent was still due, mouths still needed feeding, and so they took in laundry, scrubbed floors for wealthier households, or remarried quickly to secure survival. Children were thrust into work earlier than ever. Their grief drowned in labour as much as in tears. The mine created orphans as easily as it created coal. Boys barely tall enough to lift a pick replaced fathers lost to collapse. Their hands blistered, their eyes too old for their faces. Girls became housemaids or seamstresses, sometimes sent away to cities, their childhoods traded for wages that might keep younger siblings alive. The village cemetery filled steadily, rows of simple stones marking men who rarely lived beyond 40. Each headstone bore the unspoken inscription that all in the village understood: the mine took him. And yet community bound itself tightly against the weight of tragedy. When disaster struck, women gathered with baskets of bread and kettles of tea, comforting families whose lives had been upended. Men dug graves for neighbours as if for brothers, shouldering the weight of grief together. Hymns at funerals rose louder than on Sundays, voices trembling but steady, as if by singing they could keep the earth itself from swallowing them whole. It was in these shared sorrows that the village found strength, though it was a strength born of necessity, not choice. Evenings after tragedy were quiet. Lamps glowed faintly in windows, and the tavern filled not with laughter, but with low voices, men speaking of the ones who would never return. A miner's life was lived, with an unspoken knowledge that any day could be his last, yet still he returned to the pit each morning. To refuse was to starve, and so the chain between man and mine remained unbroken, reinforced by hunger, duty, and fear. Survival was not heroism, it was compulsion. And in the quiet hours before dawn, as wives prepared lamps and children stirred, the village braced itself again for another day beneath the earth. Evenings in the cottages followed a rhythm as rigid as the shifts underground. The men returned coated in black, their clothes stiff with soot, their eyes rimmed with red from hours in the dark. Boots were unlaced at the threshold and set aside, the leather cracked and hardened by damp tunnels. Tin basins were filled with water hauled from the pump, and wives scrubbed their husbands' faces with coarse cloths until their skin flushed raw. The water turned black within minutes, a mirror of the pit itself, and yet no amount of scrubbing could fully banish the coal that clung to their pores. Men often joked grimly that they would die as black as they had lived, skin and lungs alike. Meals after work were simple, but offered a kind of ritual comfort. A pot of stew simmered over the fire, potatoes, cabbage, carrots if the season allowed, thickened by bones boiled from Sunday's meat. The stew was ladled into chipped bowls, eaten in silence punctuated by coughs and the occasional murmur. Bread, dense and dark, was passed around in thick slices, dipped into the broth until it softened. Children leaned close to the fire for warmth, their faces ruddy, their hair damp from washing. Though the food was meagre, it was shared with an intimacy born of necessity. Each spoonful was measured, each bite stretched, and no crumb went to waste. After supper, the cottages dimmed. Lamps were lit sparingly, for oil was dear, and most families relied on the glow of the hearth to light the room. Women mended clothes by the firelight, needles flashing briefly in the gloom as they patched trousers or darned socks worn thin by endless labour. Children sprawled on straw mats or knelt beside low stools, playing games with stones or singing simple rhymes, while the adults whispered about wages, debts, and news from the pit. The air was filled with the scent of coal smoke and cabbage, heavy and clinging, and it lingered in every garment and every corner of the home. The tavern was the only escape for many. After long shifts, men gathered beneath its sagging beams, mugs of ale sloshing as they raised them in tired hands. The laughter there was rough, half-hearted, but it was laughter nonetheless, a sound that briefly lifted the weight pressing on their chests. Some told stories of accidents and near misses, as if retelling them made survival more certain. Others sat in silence, their eyes fixed on the fire, drinking until their minds dulled enough to sleep without coughing themselves awake. The tavern-keeper knew each face, each debt, each weakness, and poured pints whether coins were ready or not, for he too was bound to the mine's wages. On Sundays the tavern's clamour gave way to the hush of the church. Bells rang across the village, their tones muffled by coal smoke that drifted in plumes from chimneys. Families walked in quiet procession, boots polished as best as possible, clothes patched but neat. Inside, the pews were crowded with soot-stained villagers, their voices joining in hymns that rose like a fragile protest against the darkness of their lives. Ministers spoke of endurance, of patience, of heaven as a reward for toil on earth. Children fidgeted, mothers hushed them, and fathers bowed their heads, staring at the cracked stone floor as if searching for answers in its grooves. Despite the hardship, there were small pleasures clung to fiercely. A sweet bought for a child on payday, its sugar sharp and startling against the tongue. A fiddle played at a gathering, its notes thin but lively, coaxing feet to shuffle across dirt floors in a makeshift dance. A book passed from hand to hand, read by candlelight with lips moving silently over each word, for literacy was rare but treasured. These moments were fleeting, fragile, and easily crushed by the weight of necessity, yet they offered enough warmth to carry families through the long weeks. And always, the cough lingered, weaving through every moment like an unwelcome refrain. It echoed through taverns, through churches, through the cramped cottages lined in soot. It rattled in the throats of fathers, in the chests of mothers, in the lungs of children too young to have descended into the pit. It was the sound of coal's true price, not just the bodies buried in collapses, but the slow erosion of breath, of strength, of years stolen quietly rather than all at once. Families lived with it as they lived with the mine, ever present, ever demanding, impossible to escape. When the lamps were finally extinguished and the hearth burned low, the cottages fell into a hushed darkness. Families crowded together in narrow rooms, often sharing beds or pallets laid across the floor. Fathers collapsed onto straw mattresses, their bodies so heavy with fatigue that they barely stirred as wives tucked blankets around them. Children curled like kittens beneath threadbare quilts, sharing warmth from body to body. Sleep was not peaceful. It was survival. The coughs of the household mingled with those from neighbouring cottages, a chorus that carried through thin walls and out into the black night air. The miners' dreams were not escapes so much as extensions of their days. Many dreamed of tunnels, endless and twisting, their picks ringing against stone long after they had laid them down. Some saw flashes of light in the darkness, phantoms of the sparks they feared underground, flames that meant fire damp had caught. Others dreamed of climbing, endlessly climbing ladders toward daylight, only to find themselves still trapped below. Sleep was shallow, broken by coughing fits or the cries of children startled awake. In the quiet moments between, wives lay awake listening to the breathing of their husbands, measuring in each rattled exhale the pace at which the mine was claiming them. Night shifts brought a different rhythm. Not all miners worked in daylight hours. Some were sent below long after the village had gone still, their lamps the only glow moving through the streets. Families tried to rest, but the absence was felt sharply, the bed colder, the air somehow emptier. Wives sat up waiting, darning or knitting by lamplight until fatigue overcame them. When the men returned at dawn, they smelled of damp earth and exhaustion, their eyes wide and unblinking as if the night itself had followed them home. Sleep claimed them in daylight, the cottage shuttered against the sun, the cycle inverted but no less relentless. Even in slumber the body could not forget its burdens. Muscles cramped from crouching too long in narrow seams, back seized with pain that sleep could not smooth. Men tossed restlessly, turning in their straw, groaning softly as if wrestling invisible weights. Children slept deeper, but their small bodies were not free from the mind's grasp. Dust carried home on clothes and hair settled into their lungs, so even their dreams were punctuated by coughs. In the darkest hours, when the village was at its most still, the sound of those coughs became almost rhythmic, like the beating of some distant drum that never ceased. Outside the cottages, the mine never truly slept. Pumps thudded steadily, expelling water from the tunnels. The winding gear creaked as if sighing in its own restless slumber. Even when no men were below, the pithead loomed against the stars, its silhouette stark against the sky. The smell of coal smoke drifted over the village, seeping through shutters and under doors, a reminder that the mine's grip extended even into dreams. Families lived not beside the pit but beneath its shadow, day and night, in waking and in sleep. And then, with cruel certainty, morning came again. Roosters crowed, children stirred, and women stoked fires with scraps of coal saved from the day before. Men rose stiff and sore, pulling on boots still damp with the sweat of yesterday. Lamps were trimmed and filled, flasks packed with bread and cheese if the larder allowed, and once more the line of figures marched silently toward the pit. The night offered no escape, only a pause, and even in sleep the mine had followed them. The week was measured not in days but in shifts, a cycle that rolled on without mercy. Monday brought the heaviest weight, men trudging back to the pit after a brief Sunday respite. By Wednesday, bodies already ached with the dull exhaustion that never truly left them. Friday held no promise of relief, only the thin hope that Saturday's wages would be paid in full. The Sabbath itself was less a day of rest than a day of reprieve, a chance to wash clothes, mend tools, and breathe in air that was not laced with coal dust. The rhythm repeated endlessly, one week indistinguishable from the last, yet each carving itself into the bodies of those who laboured through it. Winter pressed hardest on the miners' lives. Snow lay heavy across the cottages, and the air turned sharp with frost, yet underground the tunnels remained damp and close, as if the earth itself cared nothing for the seasons above. Men descended into darkness wrapped in patched coats, only to strip them away in the heat of labour. When they returned to the surface, steam rose from their bodies in clouds, instantly frozen into frost against their beards and hair. Families burned scraps of coal in their grates, careful to ration it despite its abundance underground, for every lump carried the mark of unpaid labour. Children huddled together for warmth, their small fingers red and cracked, while mothers stitched blankets from old sacks and scraps of cloth. Summer brought no true relief. Above ground, the air grew hot and heavy, filling cottages with the smell of coal smoke and sweat. Underground, the tunnels grew stifling, air trapped and stagnant, thick enough to choke a man even without dust. The ponies sweated in their harnesses, stamping restlessly as flies gathered in the heat. Miners laboured bare-chested, skins slick with grime, the sweat on their backs instantly coated with black powder. On the surface, children ran barefoot through the lanes, but their laughter was muted by the hacking coughs that punctuated their games. Gardens behind cottages withered in drought or drowned in rain, leaving little beyond potatoes hardy enough to survive. The seasons shaped the rhythm of meals as much as the hours of labour. In spring, gardens yielded onions, turnips, and greens that brightened the otherwise drab stews. Autumn brought apples, sometimes baked into pies that seemed almost luxurious, though they were often tart and mealy. Winter stripped the table bare, leaving potatoes and cabbage as the staple, boiled into thin soup stretched as far as they could go. Mothers marked time not by clocks but by what was left in the cupboard, counting out meals like prayers, hoping each season's meagre harvest would last until the next. Even the air above the village bore the mark of time. In winter, smoke rose in thick columns from the chimneys, hanging low and heavy in the frozen air until the whole valley seemed swallowed by soot. In summer, coal dust clung to every surface, turning laundry grey as soon as it was hung out to dry, coating windowsills and settling in the creases of skin. The weather may have shifted, but the taste of coal in the mouth was constant, the smell of smoke an unbroken companion through every season. Life events, births, marriages, deaths, were folded into this rhythm of survival. Babies were born into the same cycle, their first breaths already tainted with coal dust. Weddings were modest affairs, celebrated with ale and fiddles, yet even as vows were spoken, everyone knew the mine would claim the groom's body and perhaps his bride's health before long. Funerals came too often, marked by processions of soot-streaked faces, hymns sung hoarsely in churchyards, and coffins lowered into earth already rich with the bones of miners past. Time did not move in neat lines in these villages. It moved in circles, one generation repeating the fate of the last. Wages were the fragile thread binding the household together, and even that thread often frayed before the week was done. Pay came in envelopes or tokens on Saturday, the men queuing outside the pay office with faces as blank as the slips they carried. The amount was always less than expected. Fines deducted for slow work, for underfilled carts, for tools deemed improperly used. Some mines paid in company scrip, tokens redeemable only at the company store, ensuring the coins earned in darkness returned immediately to the owner's till. A man might leave the pit with his lungs full of dust and his pockets rattling, only to spend half his wages that very evening on bread, lamp oil and soap priced higher than anywhere else. Debt was the shadow that loomed behind every cottage door. If rent fell late, the landlord's man would arrive swiftly, ledger in hand, ready to threaten eviction. Families stretched credit at the company store until the tally grew impossible to repay, binding them tighter to the mine. Mothers sold knitted socks, embroidered cloths, or even heirlooms in exchange for a few extra coins to cover food or medicine. Some pawned their wedding rings, hoping to redeem them after the next payday, though often the ring never returned. Debt was not simply money owed, it was a chain, as real as the shackles on any prisoner, and it clinked through every choice a family made. Children were raised in this world with little illusion. Boys grew up knowing the mine waited for them as surely as the seasons did. They watched their fathers lace boots each morning, saw the soot etched permanently into their skin, and understood that manhood was measured not by age but by the moment one descended into the pit. At 10 or 12 they were sent down themselves, their small frames suited to the narrowest seams where grown men could not fit. Their schooling, if it existed at all, was brief and broken. Letters and sums gave way quickly to picks and shovels, and the knowledge that survival demanded more sweat than ink. Girls, too, carried burdens shaped by the mine, though their paths rarely led underground. They kept house while mothers scrubbed or stitched, hauled water, minded siblings, and later found themselves working in factories or as servants in distant towns. Many were married young to miners, stepping into the cycle of washing, mending, and counting coins that defined village womanhood. They learned to scrub soot from skin, to stretch thin broth until it fed a family, to hush coughing babies in the night while praying the sound was not the start of another long illness. Childhood was brief, responsibility early, and the weight of the mine pressed just as firmly on their shoulders as it did on their fathers' backs. Yet amid all this, families clung to a fierce sense of duty to one another. Men handed wages directly into their wives' hands, knowing it was the women who kept hunger at bay and the roof overhead. Mothers rationed food with a precision that might rival any accountant, saving scraps for the sick, setting aside coins for coal to burn in the hearth, and secretly tucking away pennies for moments of joy. A spool of ribbon for a daughter, a sweet for a son. Love was expressed not in luxuries but in sacrifices, in the endless labour that kept families afloat when the pit seemed determined to drag them under. And through it all, the pit itself loomed, not simply as a place of work but as the unspoken future of every child born in the village. Its silhouette stood against the sky like a promise and a threat, its smoke drifting across the fields as if marking its territory. Parents told stories of other lives, farming, trade, service in the towns, but such paths were distant dreams. For most, the mine was both inheritance and fate, waiting patiently until small hands grew strong enough to grip a pick. Childhood was not a shield, but a brief delay before the inevitable descent underground. The cottages themselves were plain, almost uniform, each built from the same rough stone or brick, lined shoulder to shoulder along muddy lanes. Inside, the rooms were cramped and dim, ceilings low, windows small. The front room served many purposes: kitchen, parlour and sleeping space when beds overflowed. A hearth dominated the wall, its fire weak but constant, fueled by scraps of coal set aside from the pit. Above the mantel, a shelf held a scattering of keepsakes: a chipped teapot, a worn Bible, perhaps a clock if the family was fortunate. The air was always tinged with smoke, cabbage, and coal dust, a combination so constant that visitors carried it away in their clothes. Floors were often bare boards, scrubbed until they splintered, or packed earth covered with mats woven from rags. Furniture was sparse, a table scarred from years of meals, a few stools, a chest for linens, a straw mattress pushed against the wall. Beds were shared by multiple children, often 2 or 3 to a blanket, while parents slept in the same room to save heat. In some cottages, boarders lodged in corners curtained off with cloth, their presence tolerated for the sake of the few extra coins they brought. Privacy was a luxury no one expected. Life was communal by necessity, and every room carried the imprint of labour and thrift. Clothing reflected the same economy. Miners worked in rough trousers and shirts, patched again and again until little of the original fabric remained. Caps shielded their heads from low ceilings, though many bore dents and tears from years of use. Boots were prized possessions, passed from father to son when they could still hold together, resoled repeatedly by village cobblers. Women wore woolen skirts and aprons, their sleeves rolled up for work, their hands raw from endless scrubbing and sewing. On Sundays the same garments were brushed, mended and buttoned to appear respectable, though the coal dust never truly washed out. Children wore hand-me-downs in miniature, clothes cut down and stitched again, hems crooked but serviceable. The sounds of a miner's life filled every corner of the village. At dawn the creak of boots in mud marked the start of the day, followed by the clank of the cage lowering into the pit. Underground, the steady rhythm of pick striking stone echoed like a grim heartbeat, punctuated by the scrape of shovels and the groan of carts pulled by ponies. Above ground, cottages rang with the scrape of chairs on wooden floors, the crackle of fires, the sharp coughs that broke the silence again and again. Evenings brought the murmur of hymns sung softly while mending clothes, or the rough laughter spilling from the tavern door carried faintly on the night air. Smells told as much of the story as sights or sounds. Coal dust clung to everything, its acrid tang inescapable. Underground the air was thick with damp stone, sweat, and the faint metallic bite of gas. Above ground, kitchens filled with the scent of boiling cabbage, of bread crusts toasting on iron griddles, of lye soap used to scrub floors and bodies alike. Taverns reeked of ale and pipe smoke, mingling with the sour sweat of exhausted men. Even church carried the smell of coal, soot on coats, smoke rising from damp boots drying near pews, reminding everyone that the mine followed them into every space, sacred or profane. For all its sameness, each cottage bore marks of individuality carved by the families within. A bright curtain stitched from old fabric, a row of flowers planted in chipped pots on a windowsill, a child's drawing tucked behind the mantel clock, small rebellions against the grey uniformity of pit life. These details were fragile, often worn out or replaced within months, but they gave shape to pride where wages could not. They were reminders that even in a world blackened by soot, families still fought to claim some corner of colour, some flicker of beauty, however fleeting. The most relentless enemy was not the collapsing roof or the sudden blast of gas, but the slow invasion of coal into the body itself. Each breath drew in fine black dust, invisible yet inescapable. Over time the lungs hardened, coated in soot until they ceased to expand fully. Men who once swung picks with strength found themselves wheezing after a short walk, their shoulders heaving as if each breath was dragged through mud. This ailment was known as black lung, though in medical journals it carried longer names. In the cottages it was simply called the miner's cough, a companion that began quietly in youth and ended only in death. The cough became part of life's rhythm. It started as a nuisance, throats clearing in the morning, voices rough with phlegm. But as years passed, it deepened into rattles that shook the chest, leaving men doubled over, spitting into rags already stained grey. Wives collected these rags in silence, washing them in water that turned dark with soot. Children lay awake listening to their fathers struggle for air, counting the pauses between coughs with dread. Eventually, some men could not climb from their beds, their bodies as worn as their boots, lungs collapsed inward until even whispering was labour. Injuries were common and rarely healed cleanly. A pick swung carelessly could split skin to the bone. A falling stone could crush a limb in an instant. Men staggered home with fingers missing, ribs broken, or skulls cracked by rock, and yet they returned to the pit as soon as they could stand. Bandages were torn from old sheets, splints fashioned from broom handles, and rest shortened by hunger that demanded wages. Limping miners filled the tavern benches, each scar a story, each wound a testament to a system that valued coal more than flesh. Some lived with permanent stoops, their spines bent from years of crawling in low seams, their bodies twisted into shapes carved by stone. Blindness, too, claimed its share. Lamps flickered out in the dark, leaving men fumbling blindly through tunnels, where one misstep meant a broken leg or worse. Explosions singed eyelashes and burned eyes, leaving scars that glistened under firelight. Dust irritated eyes until infection set in, turning whites yellow and clouded. Men who once guided ponies through twisting tunnels found themselves unable to see their own hands in front of their faces. For them, the darkness underground became permanent, a cruel echo of the life they had lived. Hearing faded in much the same way. The ceaseless ring of picks and the crash of stone battered eardrums day after day until the world grew muffled. Men shouted to one another across short distances, their words lost in the ringing that filled their ears. At home, wives repeated themselves again and again, children tugged at sleeves to be noticed, and silence crept into cottages not as peace, but as absence. Deafness was not recorded in ledgers, not noted by overseers, but it claimed as much as any collapse did, robbing men of music, conversation, and the last comfort of shared voices. And then there were the broken bodies that never mended, legs shattered in collapses healed crooked, leaving men hobbling through villages with canes made of rough wood. Spines damaged by falling beams condemned men to chairs long before old age. Arms crushed under runaway carts left men unable to work, their families forced into poverty as quickly as if they had been buried outright. The mine had many ways of claiming its toll, swiftly in disaster, slowly in disease, or piece by piece, grinding down the body until only fragments remained. The skin itself bore the mine's signature. Coal dust clung so stubbornly that even after hours of scrubbing with lye soap, traces remained in the pores, settling into a permanent shadow. Cuts and abrasions, so common in the tunnels, often became infected in the damp air. Without proper medicine, these small wounds swelled, reddened, and sometimes spread until whole limbs were threatened. Boils and rashes appeared where sweat mixed with soot, itching furiously and refusing to heal. A miner's hands, once calloused from honest strength, became cracked, raw, and scarred, until they resembled worn leather more than flesh. The spine carried its own burden. Men spent years bent double in low seams, crawling like beasts of burden through passages too narrow to stand upright. This posture, repeated day after day, carved itself permanently into their bones. Some miners could no longer straighten fully, their backs fixed in a permanent stoop that made them appear far older than their years. Joints stiffened, knees swelled, and shoulders hunched until walking upright in daylight felt unnatural. Even in sleep their bodies curled instinctively, as if they could not forget the confines of the seam. Teeth, too, suffered under the miner's life. Meals were coarse, heavy with bread and potatoes, often lacking in the nourishment needed to keep mouths healthy. Soot worked its way into gums, turning them black at the edges, while constant coughing loosened teeth until they fell out one by one. Many men in their 30s had mouths already half empty, chewing their meagre food with difficulty, their smiles shadowed by loss. Toothache was a misery endured silently, treated only by yanking the tooth out with crude tools or paying dearly for the services of a travelling barber surgeon. Eyes never fully adapted to the dark despite years underground. Lamps flickered weakly, leaving men to squint constantly at their work, straining to see veins of coal against the rock. Dust irritated them endlessly, inflaming lids and clouding vision. Some men spoke of a permanent haze before their eyes, as though they were forever peering through smoke. Cataracts formed early, and blindness came suddenly to those caught in gas explosions, their sight seared away by heat and flame. To lose one's eyes was to lose work, and to lose work was to condemn an entire family to hunger. The heart laboured under its own invisible strain. Hours of heavy exertion, lifting, shoveling, dragging, wore it down until sudden failure was common. Men collapsed without warning, clutching their chests, breath cut short by a muscle that simply gave out after too many years of beating in darkness. Villagers carried them home, their bodies still warm but lifeless, laid gently on the same beds where their children had been born. No doctor could explain it beyond weakness of the heart, but all knew the truth. The mind consumed not only the lungs, but the very rhythm of a man's life. And then there was the suffocation. Not slow, as with black lung, but sudden and absolute. A pocket of bad air, an unseen shift of earth, and a man's lamp sputtered out, leaving him gasping in the dark. Choked passages filled with foul air robbed lungs of oxygen, and men clawed at the ground, desperate for breath that would not come. Survivors spoke of it with voices that trembled. How silence fell heavier than stone, how the darkness pressed close, how their chests burned until they thought their ribs might break. Some were pulled out in time, their bodies limp but breathing. Others remained below, claimed by the invisible hands of the earth. The cottages were hospitals in everything but name. Wives became nurses by necessity, tending to broken limbs, bandaging cuts, and pressing cool cloths against fevers. They learned to recognize the sound of each cough, the sharp rasp of a child with a cold, the deep rattle of a husband whose lungs were slowly hardening into stone. Rags were boiled to make them clean, water hauled in pails for washing wounds, herbs brewed into teas meant to soothe. Every home bore the marks of illness, bowls of broth left cooling for men too weak to rise, bottles of liniment lined on shelves, and bedding that smelled of sickness no scrubbing could remove. Children grew up under the shadow of their father's decline. They watched as strong men returned home stooped, coughing, faces grey beneath the coal dust. They learned early to tread quietly when their father lay gasping in bed to fetch water or bread without being asked, to take over chores their fathers could no longer manage. Boys who once clung to their father's boots were soon carrying his pick into the pit, stepping into the cycle before their voices had even deepened. Daughters learned to soothe their younger siblings when nights were filled with coughing, their lullabies drowned out by the ragged breathing of the men who had carried the family's weight for too long. The sound of a miner's decline was a soundtrack that haunted the village. At night, cottages echoed with hacking coughs, one voice sparking another until the whole street seemed to breathe in ragged unison. Mothers sat awake, cradling infants startled by the noise, while older children lay stiff, staring at ceilings, knowing that each pause between coughs might be the last. Sometimes silence fell too heavily, broken only by a sudden thud, the sound of a man collapsing from exhaustion or suffocation. In those moments, neighbours rushed in carrying buckets of water, lifting bodies onto chairs, whispering prayers in voices cracked with fear. When accidents struck, families bore the brunt as if the collapse had crushed them too. A man returned home with a shattered leg, and suddenly his wife's hands blistered from hauling coal herself to trade. His sons pressed into work earlier than planned. His daughters hired out as servants to wealthy houses. Widows aged overnight, faces lined by grief and the hard knowledge that their children's bellies still needed filling. A miner lost underground was mourned in the chapel, buried in hymns and black clothes, but his absence lingered most in the cottage. An empty chair by the fire, boots left by the door, wages that never came again. Despite the hardship, families did not crumble. They bent, they strained, but they held together as best they could. Wives leaned on neighbours, sharing bread when one household starved, taking in children when another mother was too burdened to cope. Boys stepped into men's roles long before they were ready, their shoulders squared by necessity. Girls grew into women with hands roughened by scrubbing and backs bent by endless chores, yet they carried on, binding families with quiet resilience. The mine might have broken the men, but it left behind women and children who carried scars just as deep, even if they were less visible. Grief was not a stranger in the pit villages, it was a regular visitor, arriving often and leaving slowly. Funerals filled the churchyards, rows of coffins borne by neighbours with soot still smudged on their faces from the morning shift. Widows dressed in black even when the fabric was faded and frayed. Children clutched their mothers' hands as hymns rose into the rafters. The bells tolled so frequently that their sound became part of the village's rhythm, like the clank of the cage or the cough in the night. Yet the grieving did not stop the work. The mine opened the next morning, as though it had not claimed a life the day before. Men descended again, their boots heavy, carrying their sorrow as silently as their picks. Hunger haunted every household, gnawing as constantly as the cough. Even when wages were stretched to their furthest, there were days when bread had to be sliced thinner, when stew was watered down to cover more bowls, when children were sent to bed with stomachs that ached and mouths that still tasted of nothing. Mothers gave up their portions quietly, pretending they had already eaten, smiling through hollow cheeks so their children would not see the sacrifice. Children learned to stop asking for sweets, for butter, for anything more than potatoes and bread. The mine might have given work, but it did not promise enough to fill a table. Rituals gave families a rhythm in a life otherwise ruled by labour. Supper was eaten at the same time each evening. The family gathered around the fire no matter how little was in the pot. Wives marked paydays by baking something sweet if they could, even if it was only a simple cake flavoured with treacle. Sundays were sacred not just for worship, but for gathering, families walking together to the church in clothes that smelled faintly of soap instead of soot. Weddings, when they came, were held in modest chapels, with ribbons pinned to skirts and fiddles playing tunes as old as the villages themselves. These moments did not erase the misery, but they threaded hope through lives frayed by hardship. Neighbours leaned on one another in ways that blurred the lines between families. A child left fatherless might be given meals at a neighbour's table, while a widow might find her wash lifted by another woman when her own arms failed. In the evenings, women gathered on stoops to share news, recipes, or grief, their voices mingling with the creak of laundry lines above them. Men carried each other home from the tavern when ale had dulled the pain too much, laying them gently on straw beds rather than letting them collapse in the mud. Community was survival. No family stood entirely alone against the weight of the mine. Grief was carried not only in silence but in ritual. At funerals, hymns were sung slowly, voices wavering but strong, the words less a farewell than a defiance that life would continue. In kitchens, candles were lit in memory of men lost underground, their flames flickering against soot-blackened walls. Children spoke their fathers' names in whispers, their small voices clinging to memories that faded too quickly. The mine took bodies, but families held fiercely to memory, turning sorrow into stories told at hearthsides, into songs sung under breath while mending clothes, into prayers offered with trembling hands. The women of the pit villages bore burdens that rarely found their way into ledgers or reports, yet their labour was as constant as the men's, and often just as heavy. When husbands returned broken or sick, wives became caretakers, soothing rattling lungs with cloth soaked in vinegar, or spooning thin broth past cracked lips. They slept lightly, listening for pauses in their husband's breathing, ready to shake him awake if silence stretched too long. Grief was not a distant possibility. It sat beside them at the hearth, an unwelcome guest they prepared for daily, even as they fought to keep it from crossing the threshold. When death came, survival fell squarely on their shoulders. A widow could not afford to retreat into mourning, for rent was still due, children still needed to eat, and clothes still needed to be mended. Many took in laundry from wealthier families in nearby towns, their hands raw from scrubbing and wringing. Others worked as seamstresses, stitching shirts late into the night by lamplight, their eyes burning with exhaustion. Some sold bread or vegetables at market, balancing baskets heavy with goods as they walked miles along muddy roads. Every coin was counted twice, every purchase weighed against the gnaw of hunger at home. Yet women also carried the weight of community. They were the ones who organised meals for families struck by sudden loss, who gathered together to clean cottages after funerals, who comforted children whose fathers would never return from the pit. They formed invisible networks of support, passing food from door to door, sharing cloth and coal when supplies ran thin. In these acts of quiet solidarity, grief was softened, if never erased, by the knowledge that no one suffered entirely alone. Mothers carried grief differently from wives. They watched their sons grow into the same cycle, that had already claimed their fathers. Every cough from a boy barely 12 years old reminded them of what awaited him. Every stooped shoulder in a teenager foretold a spine bent before its time. Mothers prayed for alternatives, for apprenticeships, for factory work, even for service in far-off towns. But the pit swallowed most of their sons just as surely as it had swallowed their husbands. The grief of seeing a child vanish into the same darkness was a wound that never healed, reopened daily with each step toward the cage. And daughters carried the legacy in quieter ways. They helped wash soot from their fathers' faces, brushed coal dust from jackets, carried buckets of water to soothe parched throats. They learned to stretch meals, to mend clothes, to bear responsibility long before girlhood had ended. Many were married young to miners, stepping directly into the cycle of grief and survival their mothers knew too well. In this way, the mine wrote itself not only into men's lungs and bones, but into the very lives of women, shaping futures with hands just as unyielding as stone. The village may have seemed small, a cluster of cottages pressed against the shadow of the pit, but its labour reached far beyond its muddy lanes. Every cart of coal hauled from the depths was bound not only for local hearths, but for factories, railways, and ships that stretched across the world. Miners knew this dimly, seeing wagons creak past loaded high, hearing of new mills rising in distant towns, but for them the scale was abstract. They felt the weight of coal not in empires or economies, but in their aching backs and coughing lungs. Coal fires lit more than kitchen stoves. They lit the great chimneys of industry. Cities to the north and south breathed the smoke of furnaces powered by the toil of villages like these. The iron rails of trains were forged in heat fed by coal, trains that themselves consumed the same black fuel to whistle across the countryside, linking towns and ports. The same soot that blackened miners' lungs blackened the skies above growing cities, coating their stone facades and dimming their streets beneath perpetual haze. The wealth that built grand houses and government halls, the wealth that funded wars and colonies, was dug from beneath the feet of men who rarely saw beyond their own valley. And yet, the miners carried this knowledge in a bitter way. They saw their wages remain meagre while newspapers boasted of industrial progress, of fortunes made by iron masters and merchants. They knew that their daily misery was the foundation of comforts enjoyed elsewhere. Families in far-off towns warmed themselves by coal-fueled fires, lit their parlours with gas lamps, and travelled swiftly by train, rarely pausing to imagine the bent bodies underground that made such progress possible. The soot that smudged the collars of gentlemen in cities was the same soot that filled the lungs of men in the pits, but only one group profited from it. Wars too were fed by coal. The furnaces that smelted cannon, the steamships that carried armies, the railways that transported supplies, all were driven by the same black stone. Men in villages like these might never see the battlefields their labour supported, yet their work was present in every weapon fired, every ship launched. While soldiers marched with rifles, miners fought their own war daily underground, though their enemy was not a foreign power but the earth itself, relentless and indifferent. The empire marched forward on coal dust, and the cost was paid in bodies buried quietly at the pit head. Even the seas bore the mark of coal. Steamships lined with iron hulls crossed oceans, their boilers fed by endless tons of fuel. The coal dug in narrow seams by boys too small for daylight travelled farther than the miners ever could, powering trade routes that spanned continents. The world shrank under steam, yet for the families in pit villages the horizon remained unchanged. Their lives circled around the same cottages, the same chapel, the same tavern, the same yawning pit. The global reach of their labour was vast, but the circle of their own existence remained painfully small. Coal became the beating heart of the Industrial Revolution, its rhythm felt in the pulse of machines, the smoke of chimneys, the shriek of whistles along new railway lines. Cities that once dozed in medieval quiet now roared with clattering looms, pounding hammers, and grinding wheels, all fed by the endless hunger for fuel. The black stone torn from narrow seams lit furnaces that turned iron into steel, steel into rails, rails into sprawling networks that stitched whole nations together. Each locomotive that thundered down a track was a monument not only to engineering, but to the miners hunched in darkness, their sweat and lungs burning so that wheels above could spin. The wealth coal created reshaped nations, Merchants and industrialists built grand houses, their walls hung with velvet and their tables laden with silver, while stock exchanges boomed with investments in mines they never set foot inside. Governments too drew their strength from coal, for it powered fleets of warships that projected empire across seas. British coal in particular became the fuel of global dominance, a resource as strategic as any army. Harbours filled with ships belching black smoke, their decks laden with goods from colonies abroad, their journeys made possible only by the tons of coal shovelled into their engines. Yet for the miners themselves, that empire's glory was a distant, bitter echo. They read of industrial progress in newspapers smudged with the same soot that blackened their fingers, progress that promised prosperity but rarely reached their doorsteps. Their wages remained low, their houses small, their food plain. While coal powered chandeliers in the parlours of the wealthy, miners' families squinted by the weak glow of a single tallow candle. While coal kept city theatres warm for audiences in velvet gowns, miners' children huddled in damp cottages, their quilts thin, their bellies thin as well. The world above grew rich on the backs of men who never saw beyond the pit's mouth. Coal's reach extended even into politics and war. Nations clamoured for it as armies once clamoured for gold. Railways carried troops with unprecedented speed, ironclads steamed across oceans, and artillery forged in coal-fired furnaces thundered on battlefields. The strength of nations was measured in coal tonnage as much as in soldiers or ships. Yet the men who extracted it gained no honour, no medals, no monuments. Their labour was invisible, their sacrifices acknowledged only in statistics, their names remembered only in churchyards where simple stones marked their early graves. And still the miners returned each day, compelled not by loyalty to empire or industry, but by the simpler, harsher truth of survival. The empire's power, the factory's might, the railway's expansion, all were fed by their bodies, broken and spent in tunnels too low to stand upright. Each lump of coal carried upward was both a spark of progress and a fragment of a man's life, traded cheaply, consumed without thought. The world above celebrated its age of steam, of speed, of expansion, never pausing to ask what it cost the men who coughed out their lungs in silence below. For the families in pit villages, the talk of progress often felt like a story told about someone else's life. Newspapers boasted of factories rising, ships steaming across oceans, and railways stretching like veins through the countryside. Children in school recited lessons about empire and industry, about how coal had made their nation mighty. But in the cottages, where meals were thin and lungs rattled, progress meant little. It was hard to celebrate the lighting of a grand city street when one's own lamp flickered weakly for want of oil. The empire might have been built on coal, but in the villages coal built only hunger, coughing and graves. When trains thundered past, the sound rattling the windows, families sometimes paused in their chores to watch. The sight was strange, both proud and bitter, iron machines streaking across the landscape, hauling goods and passengers at a speed that seemed unnatural. Mothers might point them out to children, calling them marvels of the age, but their voices held no wonder. For the children, the train was a reminder that the coal their fathers dug travelled farther than they ever would. The smoke trailing behind the carriages rose into the same sky that blackened the cottages, yet the destinations were worlds away, unreachable for those whose boots never strayed from the pithead. Factory goods found their way back into villages, though not in the form of wealth. Cheap cloth, iron pots, and second-hand books sometimes reached the company store, objects of industry priced too high for the men who had powered the furnaces that made them. A miner's wife might save for months to buy a single sturdy pan, or a child might cradle a book scavenged from a market stall, its pages torn but still legible. These small tokens were as close as families came to touching the progress so loudly celebrated elsewhere. For them, industry was not a blessing but a mirror, reflecting what others gained while they remained in soot. Even the church sermons carried the language of advancement. Ministers spoke of industry as God's tool for shaping the modern world, of empire as a blessing, of coal as the gift of the earth to fuel mankind's progress. But the villagers sat in pews, coughing into handkerchiefs, listening with eyes lowered. They knew better than most what coal cost, for they carried the price in their bodies. To them, coal was not a divine gift, but a curse wrapped in necessity, a black stone that gave warmth and wages while stealing health and years. The words of progress rang hollow in ears accustomed to the ring of picks and the wheeze of lungs. Children absorbed this contrast almost without question. In school they copied neat sentences about how coal lit cities and fueled ships. But at home they watched their fathers cough until their bodies shook, their mothers scrape soot from windowsills that never stayed clean, and their neighbours buried before their time. To a child, progress was a word spoken by teachers and preachers, but misery was what they saw in the faces around them. They grew up knowing both truths, but only one shaped their lives. Children of miners were born already marked by the pit, though no ink ever touched their names. From their first breath they inhaled the same air thick with soot that their fathers coughed into. Their lullabies were the rasp of lungs, the clatter of boots on cobblestones at dawn, the squeal of winding gears as cages descended. They watched their mothers stretch bread until it was little more than crumbs pressed together, and they learned early that hunger was not a moment but a condition. Even before they could spell their names, they understood what awaited them. The pit was not a choice but an inheritance. Boys began their service to the mine while still in childhood. At 6 or 7, some were trappers sitting alone in pitch blackness, opening and closing wooden doors to keep air flowing. Their only company was the creak of timbers and the scurrying of rats bold enough to nibble at their bread. Hours passed without voices, their young minds growing used to silence and dark. At 10, they graduated to hauling coal in baskets, crawling on all fours through passages so low they scraped their backs raw. By their teens they swung picks, shoulders straining, lungs already lined with soot. They had watched their fathers cough out their lives, and yet their own breaths fell into the same ragged rhythm, as though the mine itself had trained their lungs from birth. Girls inherited a different but no less demanding burden. They became caretakers as soon as their hands were strong enough to wring a rag or rock a cradle. They scrubbed soot from faces, boiled water for washing, patched clothes until the fabric resembled a quilt of repairs. Many left school early to help mothers with housework or to take in laundry, the steam from boiling kettles clouding their faces until their hair curled damp with sweat. Some were sent out as servants in towns, carrying with them the smell of coal no soap could erase, their wages sent back home to keep siblings fed. And more often than not, they returned to the village as brides, married to miners, beginning again the cycle of waiting, of tending, of burying too soon. Generations overlapped in ways that blurred the lines between youth and adulthood. Fathers and sons sometimes worked side by side, their picks striking in unison, the sound of one life echoing in another. A boy barely 12 might see his father stooped in pain, struggling to fill a cart, and know with certainty that his own body would carry the same shape in time. Mothers carried their daughters on their hips while teaching them to knead dough, to scrub floors, to soothe infants. The cycle repeated so faithfully that it felt less like choice and more like destiny, as though the mine itself had written the script of every life in soot and stone. And yet, despite seeing the cost written clearly in their parents' bodies, children rarely escaped. Opportunities outside the pit villages were scarce, and those who tried to leave often returned, driven back by hunger or by debts they could not repay. The mine was both jailer and provider, cruel and necessary. Each generation cursed it, and each generation entered it. The children grew into the same lives they had watched unfold before them, as though the cough, the stoop, the hunger, and the grief were heirlooms passed down as surely as a family name. Grandfathers sat by the fire with bodies bent permanently from decades underground, their voices little more than whispers between coughing fits. They carried memories of earlier days in the pits, when lamps were open, flames and explosions tore through seams without warning, when boys even younger had been sent crawling into places no grown man could fit. Their hands, twisted with arthritis, trembled as they lifted mugs of weak tea, but they carried the weight of memory as firmly as any tool. Grandchildren sat at their feet, listening half in awe, half in dread, as stories spilled of collapses survived, of comrades lost, of years endured in tunnels that seemed endless. Those stories were both warnings and inevitabilities, for the children knew they would live them too. Fathers carried the middle burden, still strong enough to labour but already marked by decline. Their coughs rattled louder each year, their spines curved further from crouching, their eyes dimmed from dust. They carried scars on their bodies and sorrow in their silence, yet they returned daily to the pit, compelled by hunger and by the knowledge that the family's survival depended on it. In them, sons saw both the pride of survival and the inevitability of ruin. Fathers rarely spoke of escape, for they knew none. Instead, they handed down tools, lessons, and the bitter resilience that was the miners' true inheritance. Children, for their part, learned not only by watching but by doing. They carried water to the pit head, fetched tools, and scrubbed soot from their fathers' faces each evening. They listened as mothers muttered prayers over the men leaving at dawn, and they memorized the rhythm of the cage chains squealing as it lowered into the earth. Play was short-lived, overshadowed by the work waiting ahead. Games with stones and sticks often mimicked the labour they saw, digging small holes, hauling makeshift carts, striking at walls of dirt as though rehearsing for the real work to come. Childhood was not a pause before labour, but a slow apprenticeship into the same darkness. Grandmothers carried their own scars, though theirs were carved in different ways. They remembered the grief of losing husbands, sons, or brothers, sometimes all three, their faces lined with sorrow, their hands worn from decades of mending. They kept households stitched together even when death or injury had hollowed them out. They told stories of famine years when potatoes failed, of winters when coal from the pit could not be spared to warm the cottages, of epidemics that swept through villages leaving rows of tiny graves. Their wisdom was survival itself, passed on to daughters and granddaughters who carried their same burdens, as though womanhood in the pit villages was defined as much by endurance as by blood. Thus the cycle persisted, each generation layered upon the last like seams in the earth. Children grew into the same roles they had watched their elders fulfill, knowing no other future. Fathers became grandfathers, stooped and coughing, while their sons stepped into their boots. Mothers became widows, then grandmothers, teaching daughters how to stretch bread thinner, how to soothe children through coughs that would one day deepen into something worse. The mine was not only a place of work, but a cradle and a grave, binding families to its rhythm across decades. Progress outside might have thundered in locomotives and factory wheels, but in the pit villages time stood still, each generation repeating the misery of the last as if fate itself was carved in coal. Change crept into the pit villages not with a roar but with a whisper, carried by pamphlets, sermons, and the rare voices of reformers who dared to speak of a different life. Inspectors began appearing at the mine entrances, lanterns in hand, notebooks tucked under their arms, sent by governments reluctantly stirred to action. They peered into tunnels, questioned overseers, and sometimes scribbled about dangers so obvious that villagers wondered why it took an outsider to see them. These inspections rarely transformed conditions overnight, but they planted a new thought among miners, that perhaps their misery was not simply fate, but something that could be challenged. Education, too, began to press against the darkness. Small schools were opened, often by chapels or reform societies, where children bent over slates instead of picks for a few hours each day. They scratched out letters with chalk, their fingers still raw from hauling coal, their lessons interrupted whenever families needed their wages more than their reading. Mothers dreamed quietly of sons who might escape the pit through books, though such hopes often faltered against hunger's demands. Still, the very idea that a child might learn to read and write, might imagine a life beyond the tunnels, was a fragile spark in villages long resigned to repetition. Resistance flickered in the taverns, where talk grew louder after a few mugs of ale. Men muttered of strikes, of petitions, of demanding safer conditions and fairer pay. Songs were sung in low voices, ballads of miners who had stood together, verses that turned sorrow into defiance. Not every man dared to join, for the risk was heavy, wages withheld, homes lost, families left hungry. But the thought took root that their labour, so essential to empires and factories, gave them power they had never imagined. Even whispers of unity carried weight in places where silence had been the norm for generations. Women played their part in these stirrings too, though their contributions were often unrecorded. They gathered in chapels and kitchens, speaking of their husbands' suffering, organising food for families during strikes, and teaching children letters at night by candlelight. Their voices rarely reached the newspapers, but their labour underpinned every act of resistance. When men hesitated to strike for fear of hunger, it was often wives who pressed them forward, reminding them that the cycle would never break if no one risked it. In the dim light of cottages, reform began as much in the whispers of women as in the speeches of leaders. These cracks were fragile, easily filled again by the weight of poverty and the grip of mine owners, yet they marked a shift. For the first time, miners began to see themselves not only as individuals trapped by necessity, but as part of something larger, as workers whose shared suffering might give rise to shared strength. Education, resistance, and reform did not erase the misery of the pits, but they wove thin threads of possibility through lives long bound in soot. And though many men would never live to see true change, their children would grow in villages where the first questions had already been asked and the first answers whispered. Strikes became the language of desperation, the only weapon miners could wield against owners who measured lives in profit margins. At first they were small, scattered, men walking out of a single pit for a few days, their absence more a plea than a demand. But as hunger sharpened and grief mounted, strikes grew bolder. Whole villages fell silent as cages stood still, ponies rested in stables, and carts sat empty at the pit head. The quiet was eerie, the air heavy with tension, yet it carried a power miners had never known. The realization that the world above, so dependent on coal, faltered when their labour ceased. Union meetings often took place in fields or chapels, places where men gathered in secrecy to avoid the eyes of company agents. By lamplight they spoke of wages, of safety, of the lives lost without recompense. Leaders emerged, not gentlemen but miners themselves, men with broken hands and soot-streaked faces who spoke plainly of injustice. Petitions were drawn up, signatures scrawled by those who could write, marks made by those who could not. These documents travelled far, reaching the desks of men in Parliament who had never descended into a seam, yet now held in their hands the grievances of those who lived and died in them. Children, too, began to enter the debate. The sight of boys barely taller than the shovels they carried, trapped for hours in the dark as trappers or haulers, stirred even some of the indifferent. Reports were written, filled with the testimonies of children who spoke in voices too thin for the burdens they carried. They told of sitting alone in blackness, of crawling through passages that scraped their backs, of being beaten if they fell asleep or slowed their work. These testimonies shocked polite society, which could ignore the coughs of grown men, but balked at the thought of children swallowed by the earth. Slowly, reluctantly, laws began to shift. The first reforms were halting, narrow. Laws were passed limiting the youngest from going below ground, though enforcement was uneven and easily evaded by desperate families and willing overseers. Inspections grew more common, and owners grumbled of interference, yet still children under 10 were pulled from pits, at least on paper. Hours were capped for older boys, and women were barred entirely from underground work. These measures did little to ease the misery of men still labouring, but they hinted at a world where the mine might one day loosen its grip, if only slightly. Unions grew bolder with each generation. Men marched in organised lines, their banners stitched by wives who stayed behind to tend children. Hymns were sung not only in chapels but in protests, voices rising together in defiance. Strikes lengthened from days into weeks, and though hunger gnawed fiercely, solidarity grew stronger. Victories were rare but real. Small increases in wages, minor improvements in safety, recognition of the union's right to exist. Each gain felt monumental, carved not from generosity but from struggle, as though the earth itself resisted every step of change just as stubbornly as it resisted each swing of the pick. Still, progress came at a crawl. For every law passed, loopholes lingered. For every strike won, reprisals followed. Families bore the cost of reform as surely as they bore the cost of labour. Children hungry, mothers weary, fathers arrested or blacklisted for daring to demand more. Yet the cracks in the cycle widened, and though soot still blackened every cottage, the thought grew stronger that life need not remain forever bound to misery. Reform was no flood, but a slow seep, each drop eroding the certainty that the pit's grip was eternal. When strikes rolled through a village, everything changed. The pit head, usually alive with the clank of chains and the creak of carts, fell silent. No cages descended, no ponies hauled, no soot-streaked men trudged home at dusk. Instead, groups gathered in fields or along the main street, their banners stitched from flour sacks and painted with words that spoke of justice, wages, and bread. The air was filled with voices, sometimes chanting, sometimes singing, sometimes simply talking more freely than ever before. For once it was not the overseers who commanded the day, but the men themselves, united by absence rather than labour. In the cottages, strikes were felt most acutely around the table. Wages stopped, and food quickly grew scarce. Bread was sliced thinner, stews stretched with more water than vegetables, and mothers went without so that children might have another spoonful. Yet hunger was endured differently during strikes. It carried a strange dignity, as if each empty belly was a statement as loud as the banners outside. Women organised kitchens, pooling what little they had to feed entire rows of families at once. Chapels became storehouses of solidarity, distributing loaves, blankets, and comfort. Though the cupboards were bare, the sense of shared purpose filled spaces where despair usually lingered. Unions did more than organise strikes, they changed the very language of village life. Meetings drew not only miners but their wives and children, who gathered outside chapels to listen to fiery speeches delivered by men whose voices cracked with both exhaustion and passion. Children grew up hearing words like rights, fairness, and solidarity alongside the usual prayers and hymns. Daughters stitched union banners by candlelight, their needles flashing as fathers dictated mottos to be carried at the head of marches. Sons learned to stand shoulder to shoulder with men older than themselves, their small fists raised in the same rhythm as the chants. Daily routines bent to the rhythm of organising. Instead of trudging to the pit at dawn, men set off to neighbouring villages, carrying news of strikes, drumming up support, and forging bonds that reached beyond their own rows of cottages. Taverns filled not just with ale and murmurs of sorrow, but with plans, debates, and strategies. A man who might once have been known only for his strength with a pick became recognised as a leader, his words carrying weight across parishes. Women kept the cottages running in his absence, shouldering double burdens with quiet pride, knowing their sacrifices underpinned the collective fight. When victories came, they were celebrated not with parades of wealth, but with the humblest of joys. A slightly higher wage meant an extra loaf of bread each week, a pair of shoes bought new instead of patched for the 10th time, or a lamp trimmed more brightly. Safety rules grudgingly accepted by owners meant fewer explosions, fewer coffins carried up from the dark. These gains, small on paper, transformed lives in ways too profound to measure. Families began to believe that change, however slow, was possible. The pit still claimed bodies, but now those left behind carried not only grief but also a growing sense of dignity, that their voices had been heard even if faintly. Unions also created new rituals of pride. Marches through villages became spectacles, with banners billowing in the wind, brass bands playing hymns repurposed into anthems of solidarity. Children ran alongside waving scraps of cloth while women stood in doorways nodding with approval. These processions stitched hope into the fabric of daily life, reminding everyone that the pit's grip was not unbreakable. Even when strikes failed and hunger returned heavier than before, the memory of standing together lingered, stronger than the chains of silence that had bound generations before. For generations, miners had seen themselves as men trapped by necessity, bound to the pit by hunger and little more. The work was misery, the wages meagre, and the village life unchanging. But as unions grew, as meetings multiplied and banners were carried through muddy lanes, something began to shift. Miners started to see their toil not as isolated suffering, but as part of a larger story, a shared struggle stretching far beyond their own pithead. Their voices, once confined to the tunnels and taverns, now joined a chorus that echoed through towns, cities, even the halls of Parliament. Identity, once measured by how many tons of coal a man could dig, or how stoically he endured collapse and cough, began to take on new weight. A miner was no longer only a provider for his own household, but a brother in a cause that spanned villages and regions. Strikes were not simply about one man's wage, but about justice for thousands. Petitions bore not only names, but pride, signatures that declared existence, humanity, and the right to be heard. Even illiterate men, making only an X beside their names, did so with the knowledge that their mark was part of something vast, something that mattered. The language of solidarity seeped into daily life. Men spoke of themselves as workers, not merely as miners. They spoke of us and them, the labouring class and the owners, the exploited and the exploiters. In taverns, conversations once limited to seam conditions or family hardships widened into debates about laws, wages across counties, and the future of labour itself. Children listened at their fathers' knees as words like union, rights, and justice became as familiar as prayers. The idea that a working man's voice could shape history, once unthinkable, began to take root in soot-stained cottages. This new identity reshaped pride itself. Where once pride came from endurance alone, the ability to survive hardship without complaint, it now grew from defiance, from standing shoulder to shoulder against injustice. A miner who marched in a strike, who held a banner aloft, who risked arrest for refusing to descend, carried a new kind of dignity. His children saw him not only as a provider, but as a fighter for their future. His wife, weary from stretching bread and scrubbing soot, saw her sacrifices reflected in victories, however small, that rippled through the village. Pride became collective, not individual, stitched together in shared struggle. Even the funerals began to change. Coffins were still carried by neighbours, hymns still rose into rafters, but now Union banners sometimes followed behind, their colours draped in mourning black. A man lost to a collapse or to black lung was remembered not only as an individual tragedy, but as part of a broader injustice. His death became fuel for speeches, his name folded into chants demanding change. Grief remained raw, but it was no longer only sorrow. It was sharpened into resolve, binding families tighter to the cause. In this way, miners began to glimpse themselves as part of a working class, a force stretching far beyond their own valleys. They read of strikes in mills and factories, of workers in distant towns making the same demands. They saw themselves not as forgotten men in forgotten pits, but as links in a chain that spanned the nation. For the first time, history felt not like something written about them, but something they might shape, however slowly, however painfully, through unity forged in soot and struggle. What began in village taverns and chapels soon rippled outward, carried by banners, pamphlets, and voices that refused to be quieted. Miners who once marched only through their own lanes now travelled miles to join rallies in nearby towns, their boots muddy, their coats patched, but their presence undeniable. Thousands gathered in open fields, their songs carrying far beyond the crowd, their chants rising into the smoke-filled skies. For the first time, the working poor saw their numbers assembled, their strength no longer hidden underground but displayed in broad daylight. These gatherings stitched local struggles into a national fabric, transforming isolated pits into nodes of a larger movement. Politicians could not ignore such crowds forever. Pamphlets landed on desks in Parliament, filled with testimonies of children forced underground, of widows left destitute, of men coughing themselves to death before 40. Reformers and journalists amplified these voices, shaming those in power with accounts too harrowing to dismiss. Laws crept forward, timid at first, capping hours for children, mandating inspections, offering the faintest protections against disaster. Though imperfect and often unenforced, each law carried symbolic weight, proof that the cries from soot-stained villages could reach the ears of those in high offices. Unions expanded their reach beyond wages and safety into politics itself. Leaders emerged not only as spokesmen for pits, but as representatives for an entire class. They spoke of suffrage, of the right of working men to vote, of laws shaped not only by landowners and merchants, but by those whose hands blistered from labour. Meetings thundered with new ideas, that the working class was not simply a body to be used, but a voice to be heard, a power to be reckoned with. For miners who had grown up believing their lives were nothing but survival, this was a revelation. History might be shaped not only by kings and captains, but by men who once swung picks in darkness. In villages, this shift was felt in small but profound ways. A miner returned from a rally with stories of thousands marching together, and neighbours gathered close to hear. Wives whispered encouragement to husbands who spoke of union dues as though they were seeds planted for a better future. Children watched as fathers practiced speeches by the hearth, words halting at first, then steady, the language of dignity slowly becoming their own. The idea that they were part of something larger seeped into daily life, reshaping how families bore their hunger and their grief. And yet, the cycle of misery did not vanish. Collapses still claimed men, coughs still echoed through cottages, hunger still gnawed at bellies. But now these tragedies were no longer endured in silence. They were named, recorded, shouted from pulpits and printed in newspapers. Each coffin carried from the pit head was one more argument for reform. Each child barred from the mines by new laws was one small victory. The balance between suffering and resistance was uneven, but the scale had shifted enough that families no longer saw themselves as powerless. Their struggles were threads in a tapestry that stretched across the nation, binding villages into movements, movements into politics, politics into history. When laws declared that the youngest children could no longer be sent below ground, villages received the news with mixed feelings. Mothers wept with relief, knowing their 6-year-olds would no longer sit alone in blackness, opening trapdoors for air. Yet fathers frowned, for each child barred from the pit was one less wage in a household that already balanced on hunger's edge. Boys sent home from the seams lingered in the lanes, restless, their hands empty of tools but their bellies still gnawing. Families stitched together survival differently. Older children shouldered more, mothers took in extra washing, daughters were sent to service in towns, the law promised protection, but in cottages it felt like another rearrangement of burdens. Inspections, too, were uneven gifts. Men in fine coats appeared at pit heads with ledgers, scribbling notes and asking questions in tones that felt more like curiosity than concern. Sometimes they ordered safety lamps or demanded better ventilation, but owners found ways to delay or dodge the rules. Underground, little changed. Miners still crouched in passages too low to stand, still breathed air thick with dust, still swung picks in heat that blistered skin. In villages, families heard of new regulations but saw little proof of them. Laws existed on paper, but hunger pressed harder than ink, and promises carried less weight than the cough that echoed through the night. Wage victories were celebrated, but their effect often dissolved quickly in the company store. A few extra coins in a pay packet meant meat in the stew for a week, or perhaps boots bought new instead of patched. But prices rose as quickly as wages, and debts gnawed just as fiercely. Families felt the change most in tiny luxuries. A sweet pressed into a child's hand, a lamp burning a little brighter, a loaf sliced a little thicker. These moments mattered, though they never erased the larger misery. The pit still claimed men, the cottages still smelled of smoke and cabbage, and hunger always waited in the corners. Even education, one of the most hopeful reforms, was uneven. Schools opened, their walls smelling of chalk and damp wood, their benches filled with children whose hands bore calluses too young. Some learned to read and write, their letters shaky but proud, while others were pulled back to the pit or the washtub as soon as families needed the coin. For those who stayed, the lessons opened windows onto worlds they had never imagined, stories of kings and explorers, of science and progress. Yet outside the mine still loomed, its cage clattering down each morning. Education was a promise, but one often broken by necessity. In the chapels, ministers spoke of these reforms as proof of God's hand in the world, evidence that justice would come in time. Families listened politely, but their eyes told another story. They knew that laws passed in distant halls could not patch boots, fill bellies, or stop coughs. They accepted what came with cautious gratitude, but never with trust. The pit remained the true lawmaker in their lives, its rules carved not in paper, but in stone and soot. Reform reached them in drips, but misery flowed without end. And yet, even in this unevenness, something had changed. Families might still live under the pit's shadow, but now they carried scraps of paper that spoke of rights, letters scratched on slates by children who could spell their own names, memories of marches where their voices joined thousands. These fragments did not undo the weight of coal, but they stitched threads of dignity through lives that had once known only silence. Reform had not freed them, but it had given them words, and words once spoken were hard to take back. The pit village never transformed overnight, no matter what was written in Parliament. Change arrived in fits and starts, like rain through a leaky roof, sometimes a blessing, often too little, too late. Families lived in the gap between law and life, where promises of shorter hours or safer tunnels clashed with the stubborn reality of hunger. Men still rose before dawn, their boots caked with mud, their shoulders stooped from yesterday's burdens. Wives still scrubbed black from their husbands' faces each evening, the cloth turning dark no matter how long they rinsed it. Reform might have whispered of better days, but soot still clung to every pore, every breath, every meal. When wages rose even slightly, the change showed itself in small, fleeting comforts. A mother might buy a bolt of cloth sturdy enough to cut into 2 dresses instead of patching the old one yet again. A father might sit by the fire with a pipe filled with tobacco instead of scraps of dried leaves. Children might taste fruit for the first time in months, its sweetness sharp and almost unbelievable. But these moments never lasted. Prices at the company store rose in tandem with wages, and debts pressed just as tightly. The extra coins that had bought a loaf one week bought only half the next. Progress always seemed to slip through their fingers like coal dust. Education brought glimmers of change, but it too lived in tension with necessity. Some children stayed in school long enough to learn to write their names clearly, to read the Bible without stumbling, to count wages with quick certainty. Others were pulled out by parents who could not afford to lose another hand's labour. In many cottages, books shared a shelf with miners' helmets, symbols of hope sitting side by side with inevitability. Mothers prayed their sons might find a path beyond the pit, but more often than not the mine swallowed them the moment they grew tall enough to swing a pick. For daughters, education ended even sooner, supplanted by the ceaseless training of keeping house, stretching food and caring for siblings. Strikes left their own mark on the rhythm of daily life. In those weeks when no man descended, the village was at once more anxious and more alive. Hunger cut sharper than usual, but the air hummed with a strange pride. Families leaned on one another more heavily, neighbours sharing what little they had, children learning the language of solidarity alongside their prayers. The pit's silence was eerie, yet it felt almost holy, a pause in the endless clatter, a reminder that the mine's grip was not absolute. And when men returned to work, sometimes with a few extra pennies or slightly safer lamps, families felt the weight of those small victories settle into their bones like warmth. Yet accidents remained the great equalizer, indifferent to reform. A collapse could undo years of progress in an instant, leaving a widow with debts and children too young to work. A cough could deepen into a death rattle despite every new law on the books. Families lived with this constant awareness, that the pit could snatch away everything at any moment. This knowledge tempered their hope, reminding them that while reforms might soften the edges, the centre remained unyielding. The mine still ruled and life was still carved in coal. Still, the smallest of changes altered the way families saw themselves. A child able to read a newspaper aloud at the hearth, a banner folded carefully in the corner of a cottage, a story of a strike carried down through generations. These were signs that the pit had not swallowed everything. Soot and hunger remained, but alongside them grew something new, a sense of belonging to a wider world, of being seen, however dimly, by forces beyond the village. Reform had not freed them, but it had given them fragments of voice, and in cottages long accustomed to silence, even fragments could echo loudly. Even amid soot and sorrow, the rhythm of the year carried traditions that no pit could extinguish. Festivals were modest but fiercely defended, a chance for families to claim joy in spite of hunger. On May Day, children wove flowers into garlands and carried ribbons through muddy lanes, their laughter rising above the coughs that so often haunted the village. Harvest brought gatherings in chapels and barns, where tables were laid with whatever could be spared: bread, cheese, apples bruised but sweet. Music filled the air, fiddles and pipes coaxing tired feet to dance, the sounds of joy sharp against the silence of loss. These moments were not escapes but acts of defiance, proof that life still pressed upward like weeds between stones. Church days marked the weeks with their own steady pulse. On Sundays, families dressed in their best, coats brushed, skirts straightened, children's hair slicked down with damp palms. They walked in quiet procession, boots crunching on gravel until the chapel doors opened to receive them. Hymns swelled, voices hoarse but strong, carrying both grief and gratitude. Ministers spoke of patience and endurance, of suffering turned to salvation. Yet the congregation heard more than words. For them, the church was not simply a place of worship, but a gathering where community reaffirmed itself, where neighbours looked into one another's weary faces and found strength in numbers. Seasonal rituals brought small sparks of wonder to children's lives. At Christmas, cottages glowed faintly with candles pressed into windowsills, their flames flickering against frost that rimed the glass. Mothers saved coins for weeks to buy oranges, the sharp scent filling the room with brightness more intoxicating than the fruit itself. Carols were sung in narrow streets, the breath of singers misting in the cold air, harmonies weaving warmth into the night. Easter brought hymns of resurrection, but also hard-boiled eggs dyed in simple colours, rolled down hills by children shrieking with delight. These customs lingered stubbornly, even when cupboards were bare, because they reminded families that life was more than labour. Markets and fairs tied villages to the wider world in ways more colourful than the newspapers. Twice a year, stalls sprang up on green patches, laden with bolts of cloth, baskets of fruit, and trinkets gleaming with brass. Families walked among them wide-eyed, fingering goods they could rarely afford but still enjoyed seeing. Children begged for sweets, the sticky sugar clinging to their fingers long after the treat was gone. Fathers sometimes spent a coin or two on small knives or pocket watches, tokens of pride that glinted briefly before soot dulled them. Mothers lingered over ribbons or needles, imagining dresses that might never be sewn but dreaming all the same. Even funerals, heavy with grief, became rituals that bound the community together. Neighbours carried coffins along paths worn smooth by generations of mourning. Women in shawls trailed behind, singing hymns that turned sorrow into a communal refrain. Graves were dug in rows, one stone after another, until whole families lay together beneath earth blackened by the same dust they had once breathed. Children watched solemnly, clutching hands, absorbing the certainty that one day their own procession would follow the same road. Yet even here, there was resilience. After burials, families gathered in cottages sharing bread, tea, and stories that kept the memory of the dead alive. Through all of this, the pit remained. Its cage still clattered, its smoke still curled into the sky, its cough still echoed through the cottages. But alongside misery grew rituals of persistence, patterns that stitched meaning into lives otherwise defined by labour. The festivals, the hymns, the ribbons, the candles, all these small acts of joy survived, not in spite of hardship, but because of it. Families clung to them as lifelines, knowing that while coal built empires and broke bodies, these rituals built something just as enduring, the will to carry on. Storytelling was as much a survival tool as bread or coal. In the evenings, when the lamps burned low and families crowded around the hearth, voices carried histories that no book had written. Grandfathers spoke in wheezing tones of disasters they had lived through, collapses that buried whole seams, explosions that turned night into fire, comrades carried up in silence. Their words were not embellished. They did not need to be. The raw facts alone were enough to silence a room, leaving children wide-eyed, staring into the fire as if they could see the tunnels in its glow. These tales were warnings, but also a kind of inheritance. Each child learned early what fate awaited them. Chapel walls echoed with another kind of memory. Ministers drew on scripture, but their sermons were embroidered with stories of miners lost and miners saved, of strikes endured, of faith held fast in darkness. Hymns themselves carried history, verses reshaped to honour the fallen, choruses altered to remind congregations of unity. When voices rose together, they carried not only prayer but memory, an oral ledger of who had lived, who had died, and who had resisted. In this way, even the act of singing became a form of remembering, each note a thread tying the present to the past. Union ballads stitched yet another layer of memory into daily life. Sung quietly in taverns or shouted boldly on marches, they told of men who had refused to bend, of wages wrested from reluctant owners, of comradeship forged in hunger and loss. The words were passed from village to village, carried by miners who travelled for rallies or work, so that a song begun in one valley might echo in another 100 miles away. Children learned them alongside nursery rhymes, their young voices carrying refrains that spoke of both suffering and pride. Through song, miners transformed pain into something enduring, something that could not be buried as easily as bodies in the earth. Mothers carried stories in softer tones, whispered to children as they worked or as they tucked them into beds crowded with siblings. They told of ancestors who had laboured in the same pits, of mothers who had stretched bread even thinner, of families who had survived winters when coal could not be spared for heat. These stories were not heroic but practical, teaching endurance, thrift, and resilience. They reminded children that while hunger and sorrow were constant, so too was the will to endure them. Memory in these stories became less about escape than about continuity, proof that others had survived the same trials, and so they might as well. Even laughter carried memory. Old men in taverns told tales of pranks played underground, of ponies that kicked overseers, of songs sung loudly enough to drown the sound of picks. Their laughter was rough and short, but it threaded through the smoke like a reminder that joy too could be remembered. For children peeking in through tavern doors, these moments carried as much weight as the grim tales, the knowledge that even in misery humanity had not been extinguished. Memory was not only sorrow, it was also the stubborn spark of life that refused to be smothered by soot. Through stories, hymns, and ballads, the villages preserved themselves. Coal might have powered empires, but memory powered survival. Each tale told, each song sung, each prayer whispered was a way of saying, "We were here, we endured, we mattered." The mine took bodies and years, but it could not silence the voices that carried on in cottages, chapels, and lanes, echoing through generations like the ringing of picks in stone. The miners' villages, with their rows of stone cottages and their smoke-darkened chapels, might have seemed small, insignificant specks on a map. Yet their endurance was part of something vast, woven into the very fabric of the age. For centuries men had dug into the earth, first with simple tools, later with machines that roared and clattered, but always at the cost of their bodies. Each generation that coughed its lungs away beneath the seams had helped drive forward forces they could barely comprehend, forces that reshaped cities, armies, and nations. The world above spoke of progress, of empires rising, of revolutions in industry, yet beneath it all lay the blackened hands of miners who rarely lived to see their 50th year. Coal was the invisible spine of the modern world. It heated homes, powered factories, and drove locomotives across continents. It carried ships across oceans, their iron bellies filled with fuel scooped from narrow seams by boys barely tall enough to lift a shovel. Kings and captains, generals and merchants, all leaned unknowingly on the labour of villages that remained half hidden in valleys, their skies choked with smoke, their streets thick with mud. The grandeur of empire and the promise of industry were written in soot as much as in ink, but the names of those who produced it were rarely inscribed in history's pages, and yet, in their endurance, the miners shaped history all the same. Their strikes slowed the beating heart of industry, forcing rulers and owners alike to reckon with the power of labour. Their unions laid the groundwork for movements that stretched far beyond the pit head, planting seeds of rights and protections that later generations would inherit. Their stories, carried in hymns and ballads, in testimonies written by reformers, in memories passed down at cottage firesides, became part of a larger tapestry of human struggle. The struggle not merely to survive, but to be seen, to be valued, to matter. From a distance of centuries, it is easy to see the sweep of coal's rise and fall, the way it carried nations into power and left scars across landscapes. But within the cottages, within the lungs of the men and the hands of the women, it was never an abstract force. It was daily bread, daily hunger, daily cough. The long arc of history is built on such intimate miseries, on bodies bent in tunnels so narrow they could not stand upright, on children's laughter cut short by the weight of labour. The endurance of miners was not heroic in the tales of kings, but it was the endurance that made those tales possible. Their lives, bound to coal, belong not only to the past but to the shape of history itself. Each cough in a cottage, each hymn in a chapel, each strike in a muddy lane was part of the great engine of change that carried the world into modernity. And though their names are lost, their endurance remains, echoing still like the ring of picks in stone through the long shadow of history. The story of the miners is not only one of toil but of time itself, written in soot and silence across generations. They lived in villages pressed tight against the pit head, their days marked by the cough, the clatter of cages, the glow of hearths where bread was stretched thin. They endured hunger, grief, and bodies broken by labour, yet they also kept festivals, told stories, sang hymns, and carried banners stitched in kitchens by candlelight. In their quiet rituals and stubborn endurance, they forged a kind of strength that empires could never fully measure. Coal lit the cities, drove the trains, powered the ships, and armed the wars, yet in the end it was the miners who bore the true cost. Their lungs became the archives of progress, their bodies the fuel of industry, their villages the unseen foundations of history. And though their names faded, their legacy endured, not only in the iron and steel of their age, but in the rites wrested from silence, in the voices that would one day rise louder because they had whispered first. Now, when the smoke has long drifted away and the pitheads stand quiet against the sky, the memory of their endurance lingers. It lingers in chapels where hymns once rose, in stories still told of hunger and courage, in the soft echo of children's laughter carried through narrow lanes. The miners' lives, humble and harsh, remind us that history is not only made by kings and generals, but by those who laboured unseen in darkness, carrying the weight of a world that never fully saw them. And so we leave the village once more, lamps dimmed, hearths cooling, streets hushed beneath the stars. The cough has quieted, the tools are laid aside, and for a moment the world above and the world below are still. Their story, heavy yet enduring, rests now in memory, in the long arc of history that bends quietly through time. Beyond the cottages, the landscape itself bore the mark of coal. Hills once green grew bare where spoil heaps rose, black mounds of waste rock piled high against the horizon. Streams ran dark with silt, their waters thickened by the runoff of the pits, their banks lined with reeds that no longer swayed as freely in the current. Yet in the mornings, when mist clung low, the land still carried a quiet beauty. Fields of barley waved pale gold beneath skies streaked with smoke, and sheep grazed calmly in meadows that stretched almost to the pit gates, as if nature itself insisted on pressing forward despite the scars carved upon it. The sounds of the pit were unceasing. By day, the rattle of chains and the groan of winding gear filled the air, a rhythm as steady as breathing. By night, even when the cages rested, pumps thudded in the dark, expelling water from the seams, keeping the earth from swallowing men alive. The village never knew silence. It lived inside a constant hum, a background pulse that seeped into dreams. Children grew up with it as naturally as birdsong, their lullabies accompanied by the deep mechanical sigh of the mine. To those who left and later returned, it was the sound that most haunted them, proof that the pit ruled every hour, waking and sleeping alike. In the lanes, life continued its slow routines. Women bent over wash-tubs, arms red from cold water, clothes pegged to lines that sagged with the weight of damp fabric. Children ran barefoot through puddles, their laughter sharp against the coughs of their elders. Men gathered at the pump, filling buckets with water to carry into homes where steam rose from kettles and the smell of cabbage clung to walls. Evenings brought the tavern's glow, the thrum of voices muffled by wooden doors, the scrape of boots on stone as men stumbled home. The village's rhythm was worn smooth by repetition, its pattern so constant that change felt almost impossible, and yet memory stretched beyond the present. Old men remembered when the pit was smaller, when seams were shallower and work, though still harsh, had not yet consumed lives so quickly. They spoke of how villages had grown, how more cottages had been built, more mouths fed by the mine, more coffins carried to the chapel yard. Younger men listened, half in awe, half in dread, knowing that the same stories would one day fall from their lips. Generations overlapped in these conversations, the past folding itself neatly into the present, as though time itself had learned to stoop under the weight of coal. The pit ponies too were part of this endurance. They descended young and rarely saw daylight again, their eyes adjusting to darkness until it became their world. They hauled carts endlessly through tunnels, hooves echoing on stone, tails swishing against the damp. Children loved them fiercely, sneaking them scraps of bread or strokes along their necks when no overseer watched. The ponies endured silently, just as the men did, their strength bent to the same endless rhythm of labour. In chapels and cottages, prayers were whispered for them too, for all the souls, human or otherwise, that carried the burden of the mine. The seasons draped themselves over the villages, each carrying its own burdens and small mercies. In winter, snow blanketed the spoil heaps, turning their jagged edges into soft white mounds that almost looked pure, though the coal beneath was never far from sight. Children skated on frozen ponds until their toes numbed, cheeks flushed red, laughter rising like smoke into the cold air. Yet the cold pressed hardest inside the cottages, where fires sputtered low and breath misted in the dark. Families huddled close beneath blankets patched from old coats, sharing warmth body to body, while outside the chimneys coughed black plumes into the grey sky. Spring crept in with mud and renewal alike. Rain turned lanes into slick trenches, boots sinking deep, hems of skirts heavy with wet soil. But blossoms still appeared in hedgerows, small splashes of white and pink that seemed almost defiant. Women planted potatoes in back gardens, fingers numb from digging but hearts lifted by the thought of a harvest months away. Children ran barefoot once more, chasing lambs through fields where grass grew in patchy shades of green. The pit still roared, still claimed its toll, yet the world above ground insisted on pushing forward, weaving small beauty through the smoke. Summer brought heat that pressed down even in the tunnels. Men worked shirtless, their backs gleaming with sweat, dust clinging until their skin became a slick grey mask. Above ground, children tumbled in streams, splashing until their mothers called them in for bread and broth. Clothes hung to dry in the warm breeze, though the air carried soot that settled on every fabric. Festivals were held in open fields, fiddles ringing out, neighbours gathering to share bread, beer and laughter. For a few hours the weight of coal seemed lighter, though the spoil heaps loomed dark at the edge of every celebration. Autumn painted the land in muted tones, rusted leaves, pale skies, fields stripped bare. Harvest brought a kind of gratitude, modest tables filled with what the soil had yielded, chapels echoing with hymns of thanks. Families stored potatoes in bins, salted meat in barrels, and hoped it would last the winter. Children dragged sticks through fallen leaves, their crackle loud against the hush of shortening days. Men walked home under skies streaked with early darkness, lamps swinging from their hands like tired stars. The turning of the year felt both heavy and familiar, a circle as unbroken as the cycle of the mine itself. Even the nights carried their own textures. In cottages the crackle of the hearth was joined by the soft creak of wooden beams as the house settled in the cold. Outside, owls called from trees that lined the fields, their hoots drifting faintly over the quiet lanes. Dogs barked at distant shadows, their sound carrying far in the still air, and beneath it all the mine kept its own night song, the groan of pumps, the faint grind of machinery, the sigh of air drawn through shafts. The village slept to these sounds as surely as to lullabies, soothed and haunted in equal measure, and always in the midst of seasons, sounds and smells, the pit ponies moved through their dim world. Their hooves rang against stone, their harnesses jingled softly, their ears flicked at echoes no man could hear. They became companions to miners, silent listeners to songs hummed in darkness, bearers of loads that no man alone could carry. Children peered into the stables when the ponies were brought up for brief rests, pressing their faces to rough muzzles, whispering secrets into ears that twitched gently. In the memory of the village, these creatures were as much a part of life as fathers, brothers or neighbours, fellow sufferers in a world ruled by coal. Meals were the anchor of each day, though they were modest and often repeated. In winter, pots of stew simmered endlessly on the hearth, thickened with potatoes, cabbage, and whatever scraps of meat could be spared. The scent clung to walls and clothing, mingling with smoke until it became the very smell of survival. In summer, meals were lighter, bread with cheese, onions pulled fresh from the soil, apples eaten raw with juice dripping down children's chins. Treats were rare but memorable, a pie baked at harvest, sweetened with sugar saved for months, or boiled sweets bought at market, sucked slowly to make them last. Even in hunger, families found ritual in eating together, the scrape of spoons and the sharing of bread binding them in quiet companionship. Clothing told the story of thrift as clearly as ledgers or debts. Men wore trousers patched so often that the fabric became a patchwork of seams upon seams, shirts stiff with years of coal dust that no washing fully removed. Boots were prized, resoled, and restitched until their leather barely held together, handed down from father to son when feet grew large enough to fill them. Women wore wool skirts and aprons faded by countless washes, shawls pulled tight in winter, hems dampened by snow or rain in colder months. Children wore whatever could be cobbled together, garments cut down from adult clothing, sleeves rolled and pinned, shoes tied with string when laces snapped. On Sundays, families brushed and straightened these same clothes, making them neat if not new, carrying into chapel a dignity stitched from patience rather than fabric. Inside the cottages, interiors shifted with the seasons. In summer, windows were propped open with sticks, letting in warm breezes that carried soot as surely as the air. The floors were swept daily, though dust settled again before the evening meal, coating chairs and tabletops in a thin film. In winter, the hearth dominated, its glow reflecting in the brass kettle, or the single clock that ticked steadily above the mantel. Beds were piled high with blankets patched from old coats, straw mattresses stuffed anew with dry rushes. Light came from tallow candles or oil lamps, their flames flickering shadows across the low ceilings, making rooms feel smaller but more intimate. Every object bore marks of use, but each was cherished, for nothing came easily and everything had to endure. Children's toys reflected this same economy. A carved wooden horse whittled by a father in the evenings, its edges smoothed by small fingers. Rag dolls stitched from scraps of cloth, their button eyes mismatched but beloved. Pebbles arranged into games on the floor, sticks turned into swords, or picks in imitation of the adult's world. Laughter echoed from these small inventions, proof that even in scarcity, imagination thrived. These toys passed from one child to the next, carrying stories as much as amusement, reminders that joy could be fashioned from whatever the earth and the home provided. Smells filled the cottages with their own seasonal rhythm. In spring, damp earth clung to boots stacked by the door, mingling with the scent of onions and leeks. In summer, clothes drying on lines filled the air with soap and sun-warmed fabric, while the tang of cabbage stewing lingered in kitchens. Autumn brought the sharp scent of apples stored in bins, their sweetness pressed against the heavier smells of coal smoke. Winter carried the acrid bite of soot, the musty odour of damp wool drying by the fire, the faint medicinal tang of liniment rubbed into aching backs. These scents layered themselves into memory so deeply that even decades later those who left the village could recall them instantly. Through all these details, life repeated itself in a rhythm both weary and enduring. Meals eaten, clothes mended, rooms swept, toys played with. Each act small, yet stitched together they formed the fabric of survival. Nothing was wasted, nothing taken for granted. Families endured not only through strength but through the careful tending of the ordinary, the rituals of food, clothing and home that gave shape 2 days otherwise consumed by the mine. The soundscape of the village was its own kind of symphony, harsh yet familiar. At dawn, boots thudded along cobblestones, their rhythm broken by the creak of wooden carts and the snort of ponies waiting to descend. The pit's winding gear groaned awake, chains clattering, pulleys whining in tones that carried for miles. Inside cottages, kettles whistled softly, spoons clinked against tin bowls, and the cough, always the cough, rose like a refrain from every lane. By midday the air hummed with the steady strike of picks underground, though above ground it seemed eerily still, as if the earth itself held its breath while men laboured below. Weather shaped every sound and sight. Rain turned lanes into narrow rivers, water splashing against boots and trickling into cottages through gaps around doors. Wind howled across the spoil heaps, carrying soot into eyes and throats, rattling loose shutters until they banged through the night. Snow softened the village, muffling the pit's clamour, but it also froze pumps, stiffened hands, and made the walk to the mine treacherous. Sunshine was rare and fleeting, yet when it pierced through the smoke children chased it, playing in patches of light as though warmth itself was a game. Seasons did not just colour the village, they commanded it, bending each day to their will. Nights carried their own textures, a mixture of stillness and unease. The cottages glowed faintly from their hearths, light seeping through shutters in thin golden lines. Voices drifted from taverns, laughter rough but genuine, the scrape of chairs and the slam of mugs punctuating songs sung off-key. Dogs barked intermittently, their calls echoing off stone walls, while owls hooted from the dark edges of fields. Beneath it all lay the low, steady thump of pumps at the pit, a heartbeat that never ceased, reminding the village that even in rest the mine remained awake. Sleep came slowly, interrupted by coughs, by the cry of a child, by the faint whistle of wind through the cracks. In summer evenings, windows opened wide brought in the smell of warm earth, mingled with the tang of soot that never left the air. Crickets sang in the hedgerows, their rhythm steady beneath the occasional shuffle of boots returning late from the tavern. Children, too restless to sleep, whispered to each other in shared beds, their voices rising and falling like the flicker of candlelight. In winter, nights were tighter. The village huddled against the cold. Fires crackled, blankets piled high, families pressed close, their shared warmth the only shield against the frost that crept in around windows and doors. The silence was broken only by hacking coughs and the sharp snap of wood splitting in the fire. Even storms carried their own memory. Thunder rolled across the valley, rattling shutters and sending ponies stamping in their stables. Rain lashed against slate roofs, trickling down walls and pooling in muddy yards. Families lay awake listening, each clap of thunder echoing like the explosions they feared underground. Children pulled covers over their heads, while parents stared at dark ceilings, their minds half in the present storm, half in the memory of the pit's dangers. Yet with each storm that passed, life resumed its rhythm again, the sounds of the mine returning to drown out nature's fury. Through sound and weather alike, the village lived in a constant interplay of harshness and resilience. The mine's mechanical song, the coughs in the cottages, the laughter in taverns, the hymns in chapels, all combined into a single unbroken score. It was a music of endurance, one that played on whether the sky was heavy with smoke, bright with sun, or weeping with rain. Families grew accustomed to it, measuring their days not by clocks or calendars, but by these familiar notes in the long symphony of survival. The sense of touch was a constant reminder of the pit's claim. Miners' hands grew hard with calluses, the skin thick and ridged from gripping picks, shovels and chains. Yet even hardened palms cracked in winter, splitting until blood welled in thin lines that stung with each movement. Clothes were coarse, wool and linen rough against the skin, aprons stiff with lye soap, boots rubbing blisters into ankles until calluses formed there too. The grit of soot never left their bodies. It collected under fingernails, settled into hair, and clung to skin so firmly that even after scrubbing, a faint shadow remained, a constant reminder of labour that marked them as surely as scars. Children felt the mine's touch in smaller but no less vivid ways. Their bare feet toughened against mud and cobblestones, yet they still flinched at cold puddles or sharp stones hidden in the lanes. They learned to haul buckets whose handles bit into small fingers, to carry wood that left splinters deep in their palms. Mothers' hands were raw from scrubbing, red and swollen in winter, soft only when they smoothed a child's hair or tucked blankets around them. Touch was not only sensation, it was survival, the endless friction of bodies against work, against cold, against time. Taste carried its own rhythm, shaped by hunger as much as by food. Bread was dense, sometimes sour, its crust tough, but filling. Potatoes were the staple, boiled, baked, mashed, or dropped into stews until they fell apart into starch that thickened the broth. Meat was rare, scraps of pork, bones boiled until marrow seeped into soup, a chicken stewed on Sundays if wages stretched far enough. On special days, a bit of treacle drizzled over bread transformed a plain meal into something almost festive, its sweetness startling against tongues accustomed to bitterness. Children licked every trace from their fingers, savouring it as though it were a treasure. Drink carried its own weight. Water drawn from village pumps often tasted of iron and stone, cool and heavy in the mouth. Tea, when affordable, was brewed weak, stretched through multiple infusions, its bitterness softened with a trickle of milk or none at all. Ale-filled mugs in taverns, frothy and sharp, loosening voices and laughter after long shifts. For some, it dulled pain enough to make sleep possible. For others, it became a trap, draining wages before they reached the table at home. Even taste, like everything in the village, was caught between necessity and escape, between hunger and fleeting comfort. The air itself had a taste, though no one spoke of it directly. Coal dust lingered on the tongue, metallic and bitter, settling in mouths as easily as it did in lungs. Children grew up with it, their first words shaped around breaths laced with soot. Mothers tasted it when they kissed their children's hair, fathers when they wiped sweat from their brows and licked cracked lips. Even in chapels, as hymns rose, the air carried the tang of smoke, mingling with incense and candle flame until the sacred too was flavoured by coal. It was a taste that could not be washed away, one that lingered long after meals were eaten and songs were sung. In this world of touch and taste, life unfolded in textures both harsh and familiar. The roughness of tools, the sting of soap, the weight of calluses, the flavour of bread stretched thin, all became as much a part of daily memory as the cough or the clatter of chains. Families endured not only through strength of will, but through the body's constant negotiation with its world, finding meaning even in the grit on their tongues and the ache in their hands. The mine's air carried a smell all its own, thick and unforgettable. Damp stone pressed its chill into every breath, mingled with the sharp tang of sweat that clung to men working in cramped seams. The faint but constant scent of oil from lamps burned low, smoky and metallic, marked the tunnels like an invisible thread. In some passages the reek of gas lingered, a sour, almost sweet note that raised the hair on the back of men's necks, for it meant danger hidden in the darkness. Even the ponies left their trace, the musky odour of their bodies and the ammonia of their stables drifting down into the seams. For those who worked there, these smells became familiar as bread and earth woven into every inhalation. Sight in the pit was never whole, only partial. Lamps flickered weakly, their glow stretching only a few feet before surrendering to darkness. Walls of coal glittered faintly where freshly cut black faces sparkling like stars trapped underground. Shadows hunched across every corner, exaggerating shapes until tools seemed like spectres and timbers like looming figures. Dust floated in the lamplight, turning the air itself into a curtain of grey. For boys sitting alone as trappers, waiting to open and close wooden doors, the darkness was almost complete, an endless blackness, broken only when a lamp passed briefly by, leaving them swallowed once more in silence and shadow. The sounds underground were amplified by the narrow tunnels, every strike of a pick echoing down passages until it seemed a chorus of unseen labourers worked in the dark. Timber creaked with the weight of earth pressing down, sometimes groaning like a living thing. Water dripped steadily from ceilings, puddling at men's boots, its rhythm a reminder of the flood that was always threatening. In moments of stillness, the air seemed alive with breath, the panting of ponies, the cough of men, the faint rush of air through crude ventilation doors. Silence itself was rare, and when it came, it felt almost menacing, as though the earth itself were listening. Touch underground was harsher than above. The coal itself was sharp, its edges cutting into hands and knees when men crawled through narrow seams. Tools grew slippery with sweat, their wooden handles slick until they threatened to slide from tired fingers. The ground was always damp, clothes clinging to bodies heavy with moisture, boots squelching in unseen puddles. Backs brushed ceilings so low they forced men to crawl, and the constant stooping bent spines into shapes that rarely straightened. Dust-coated skin until it formed a second layer, gritty and dry, turning sweat into black streaks that carved paths down faces. And always there was the weight of the unseen, the knowledge of thousands of tons of rock suspended above fragile timbers. Every groan of wood, every distant crack, was felt as much as heard, pressing into the bones of those below. The pit was not only darkness but pressure, a world where the body carried constant reminders of its fragility. Men grew used to it, but never comfortable. Even the most seasoned miners crossed themselves or muttered a prayer when a tunnel shuddered around them. Children learned early that the earth was no gentle place, and that survival underground was as much a matter of endurance as of skill. The underground world was another universe, harsh, closed, and complete. When men rose back into daylight at shift's end, they blinked against the sun as if returning from some other realm. The smell of damp and oil lingered in their clothes, the dust clung to their hair, the echoes of picks and creaking timbers followed them into sleep. Even in their dreams the mine remained, a shadow pressed into every sense, a place that claimed not only their hours but their very bodies. For the boys, the pit was a place of long waiting. Trappers sat alone in tiny recesses carved into the walls, their task simple yet vital, to open and close wooden doors that controlled the flow of air. The darkness around them was nearly total. Hours passed with only the sound of dripping water or the sudden rush of wind when a door swung open. Some sang softly to themselves to keep fear at bay. Others carved marks into wooden posts to measure the time. Rats scurried in the shadows, their claws scratching against stone bold enough to steal crumbs from pockets. For a child, this silence was heavy, pressing not only on their ears but on their spirit, as though the earth itself demanded their obedience. The ponies, sturdy and patient, lived almost entirely in this world below. Led down shafts while still young, They adapted to the darkness until it became their home. Their eyes grew used to the weak lamplight, and their movements were steady, deliberate, unhurried. They hauled heavy carts filled with coal, their harnesses creaking, breath steaming in the close air. Miners spoke to them gently, treating them as companions as much as beasts of burden. Some ponies learned the rhythm so well they stopped at the right places without being guided, as if they too had memorized the paths of the tunnels. When they were brought to the surface for short rests, they blinked rapidly against the sunlight, stamping their hooves as though startled by the vastness of the sky. For the men, work was endless motion against resistance. Picks struck coal with a sharp clink, breaking it into fragments shoveled quickly into carts. Backs bent low, muscles straining, breath rasping in the dusty air. Sweat carved streaks into the black that coated their faces, dripping onto the coal itself. Talk was sparse, reserved for warnings, jokes shouted into the dark, or hymns hummed softly to steady the rhythm of labour. Every action was measured by endurance, how long a man could swing, how much he could lift, how far he could crawl without stopping. Injuries were frequent, cuts from sharp edges, bruises from falling rock, fingers crushed between carts and walls. Yet the work continued, driven by the knowledge that wages, however meagre, kept families alive above. Accidents were the unspoken terror, always present in thought if not in word. A sudden crack could signal timber giving way, a rumble in the distance the start of a collapse. Explosions came without warning, fire damp igniting with a spark, filling tunnels with fire and smoke. Men who survived stumbled blindly back to the shafts, their faces burned, their lungs seared by gas. Those who did not were carried up later, wrapped in canvas, their families waiting at the pithead with dread already heavy in their eyes. These fears were never far, even in the quietest moments underground. Each man knew that survival was as fragile as the flicker of his lamp. The underground world pressed itself into the body and the mind. Boys grew old before their time, their backs already stooped by adolescence. Men carried scars hidden beneath their shirts, burns, cuts and joints swollen from years of strain. Dreams were filled with tunnels, their narrow walls closing in, the echo of picks and the creak of timber repeating endlessly. Even on Sundays when the pit rested, its presence followed them, on their skin, in their lungs, in the silence that felt incomplete without the sounds of work. The mine was not just a place they entered each day, it became part of who they were, shaping their lives as deeply as stone itself. The shift began before dawn, when men and boys gathered at the pit head, lamps trimmed and lit, boots laced tight. The air was cool above, carrying the scent of damp grass and chimney smoke, but soon they descended into a world without morning. The cage rattled as chains lowered them down, iron groaning, the shaft walls rushing past in flickering lamplight. Breath misted in the chill air, but soon the damp heat of the tunnels closed in, wrapping itself around their bodies like a heavy cloak. The deeper they went, the more the outside world seemed to vanish, until all that remained was darkness, oil flame, and the endless smell of stone and sweat. The trappers went to their posts first, slipping into small holes cut into the walls, doors closing behind them with a heavy thud. For hours they would sit alone, opening and shutting doors to push air through the workings, their only company the distant shuffle of boots and the occasional rush of ponies pulling carts. Farther in, the drivers led those ponies along narrow passages, coaxing them forward with low whistles or soft words. The animals strained against their loads, hooves slipping on wet stone, breath steaming in the close air. Their steady pace set the rhythm of the tunnels, the creak of harnesses and the rumble of wheels a constant background to the work. At the coalface, hewers crouched low in seams barely high enough to crawl through. Picks struck hard into black walls, sparks sometimes flashing as metal met stone. Each swing chipped away small fragments, shoveled quickly into waiting tubs. The lamps cast a faint yellow glow, barely strong enough to show the glitter of coal dust in the air. Sweat ran freely, soaking shirts, dripping onto the very coal they cut. Knees pressed into damp ground, backs bent so low that muscles ached long before the first cart was filled. Conversation was brief, often only muttered warnings or hymns sung under the breath to steady the monotony. Hours passed in this rhythm, pick, shovel, cart, pick again, until the body blurred into the work. Breaks were short, a hunk of bread pulled from a pocket, washed down with a swallow of water gone warm in its tin. Laughter sometimes echoed suddenly in the tunnels, a joke shared, a song half remembered, small flashes of humanity in the dark. Yet silence soon returned, broken only by the ceaseless labour and the creak of timbers straining under the weight of the earth. Every man knew the silence could shatter at any moment, with a crack, a rumble, a roar that signalled disaster. Toward the end of the shift, the carts grew heavier, filled to the brim, ponies straining harder with each load. Men's faces were streaked with black and grey, only the whites of their eyes and the gleam of sweat visible in the lamplight. When the order finally came to stop, tools were set aside with weary relief. The ponies were led back to their stables, their ears flicking at the sudden quiet. The trappers emerged from their holes blinking as though they had been swallowed by the earth itself. Together they made their way back toward the shaft, their steps slow, bodies aching, lungs burning with dust. The cage clattered upward, carrying them back toward the surface. Light widened above, faint at first, then brighter, until it flooded the shaft like something almost unreal. Emerging into daylight felt like returning from another world, one that lingered on their skin and in their lungs. Men blinked against the sun, their faces blackened but their eyes bright with exhaustion. The shift was done, but the mine remained etched into them, its weight in their bones, its dust in their mouths, its shadows clinging long after they stepped back into the village lanes. The day began like so many others, the same slow gathering at the pit head, the same rattle of the cage, the same plunge into darkness. Lamps flickered against damp stone, the air heavy with the familiar mix of oil, sweat, and coal dust. The men crouched at the face, picks striking rhythmically, carts rolling back and forth with their loads. Yet from the start there was a tension in the air, a groaning in the timbers that seemed louder than usual, a dampness dripping heavier from the ceilings, as though the earth itself was restless. Miners worked on, for work never paused for unease. Hunger pressed harder than fear, and every stroke of the pick was wages scraped from the stone. Hours wore on, the tunnels filled with the usual sounds, tools striking, ponies snorting, water dripping, but then a crack echoed, sharp and sudden. Men froze, tools held mid-swing, lamps trembling in their hands. The sound came again, deeper this time, like thunder buried in stone. A timber splintered nearby, the groan of wood followed by a shower of dust falling from the ceiling. Hearts pounded, breath caught, eyes darted in the dim light. For a moment no one moved, as if motion itself might bring the roof down upon them. Then, slowly, cautiously, work resumed, because it had to. Fear was swallowed, though it sat heavy in the stomachs of every man crouched there. The trappers heard it too, though their doors creaked open and shut as usual. Alone in the dark, the boys clutched their lamps tighter, listening to the distant cracks and rumbles that rolled through the passages. Some whispered prayers under their breath, too softly for anyone to hear. The pony shifted uneasily, hooves stamping, ears flicking at sounds men could not hear. Drivers patted their necks, murmuring soothing words, as if calming the animals would calm themselves. The air grew thick with dust, each breath harsher, rasping in throats already raw. Every noise carried the threat of collapse, yet the tunnels held, suspended between danger and endurance. Later in the shift a small fall came. Rocks tumbled suddenly from a side passage, crashing into the floor with a roar that echoed like cannon fire. Men shouted, scrambling back, coughing as dust engulfed them. A pony reared, cart tipping as coal spilled across the ground. When the dust cleared, no one was crushed, though one man's arm was gashed deep by flying stone, blood dark against the coal dust on his skin. They bandaged him quickly with a strip of cloth, sending him back toward the shaft while the others steadied themselves and returned to work. Relief was sharp, but it carried its own weight. Everyone knew the next fall might not be so merciful. When the shift finally ended, the men emerged from the cage in silence, faces blackened, eyes haunted. Families waiting at the pit head searched their ranks with urgency, counting husbands, brothers, sons. Wives saw the bandaged arm and knew it could have been worse, knew it could have been their own. Children clung tighter to fathers' legs, sensing unease even if they did not understand its cause. That night, cottages were quieter than usual, lamps burning lower, conversations hushed. The danger had passed, but its echo lingered, a reminder that each descent was a bargain with the earth, and that survival was never promised, only borrowed for another day. The story of the miners is, in the end, a story of endurance. They lived beneath the shadow of the pit, their days measured by the clatter of cages and the cough that never left their lungs. Their hands bore calluses, their clothes carried soot, their homes smelled of cabbage and coal smoke. They worked in tunnels where light barely reached, guided ponies through endless dark, and raised children who learned too soon the weight of labour. Yet through it all they sang hymns, told stories, celebrated festivals, and carried one another through grief and hunger. Their lives were marked by hardship, but also by resilience woven into every meal shared, every hymn sung, every banner lifted in defiance. Coal-fueled empires powered ships and drove machines that transformed the world. But for the miners and their families, it was never progress they felt. It was survival. They gave their strength, their health, their years, and often their very lives to an industry that seldom saw them as more than numbers in a ledger. And yet in the chapels where hymns rose, in the schools where children scratched their first letters on slates, in the unions that carried their voices into the wider world, they carved out dignity where little had been granted. Today the pitheads stand silent, the winding gear rusting, the spoil heaps softened by grass. The villages remain, though changed, and the stories of those who laboured in darkness still echo. They remind us that history is not only made by rulers or generals, but by the countless men, women and children who endured unseen, who bore the weight of coal in their lungs, in their hands, in their bones. Their suffering was real, their resilience remarkable, their legacy enduring. So as the lamps dim and the hearth grows quiet, we leave the miner's world behind, not in silence, but in remembrance. For though the coal dust has long since settled, the story of their endurance still lingers in the air, like the faint hum of a song carried down through time.